Think back to when you were a kid. One of the absolute best things about being young was going to a sleepover at your best friend's house. For me, that friend was a boy named Joe. Joe had this amazing house. It was huge, but the best part about it was the basement. It was fully finished with a pool table, air hockey, and a giant looping layout. Joe and I would spend hours down there riding our scooters in circles on the smooth floor. We would get these massive sugar rushes from eating junk food and playing video games late into the night. And the best part of all was that Joe's parents slept all the way upstairs. They could never hear us. We could make as much noise as we wanted, and we felt like we owned the place. I will never forget the night my mom dropped me off at Joe's house. It was right before a major holiday, which meant we did not have any school the next day. We had the entire night to ourselves. After dinner, we went straight down to the basement. Joe had just gotten a new game for his PlayStation, and we were completely locked in, staring at the screen. And then, right in the middle of our game, the door to the laundry room in the back creaked open. Joe paused the game. We both turned around to look. The door was now cracked open just a little bit, revealing a sliver of pitch black space inside. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told Joe he should go check it out. He shook his head and said it was fine, that the door did that sometimes on its own. But to be honest, even though we loved the basement, being down there alone at night could get pretty spooky. And so, I told him to just go shut the door anyway. Having that door open, looking into a dark, empty laundry room, was making me really uncomfortable. Joe must have felt the same way, because he got up, walked over, and pushed the door shut until it clicked. We went back to our video game, trying to forget about it. After a while, we decided to switch things up. I grabbed Joe's bicycle and started riding around the basement loop. It sounds silly, but it was actually incredibly fun. I was pedaling fast, zooming around the corners, but then another sound cut through the air. It was a loud noise, like someone slamming the door of a washing machine or dryer inside the laundry room. It was unmistakable. This time, we did not hesitate. Joe and I scrambled up the basement stairs as fast as our legs could carry us. We were completely freaked out. When we got upstairs, Joe called his dad and told him what we heard. His dad groaned, got out of bed, and walked down to the basement to check. He opened the laundry room door, took a quick 5-second look inside, and then turned back to us. He calmly said there was nobody in there. He told us to stop letting our imaginations get the best of us, and then he went back upstairs to bed. Joe and I felt a bit silly, but we decided to stay downstairs and hang out for another hour or two. Eventually, we got tired and decided it was time to go to sleep. There were 2 couches in the basement, one by the TV and another near the bar. I took the couch near the back, while Joe took the one by the TV. I laid down and tried to sleep, but I did not sleep for very long. I woke up in the middle of the night. It was still pitch black down there. There was absolutely no light coming through the small basement windows. It was dead silent. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, and then suddenly I got this overwhelming icy feeling that someone was watching me. It was that instinctual feeling you get when you are not alone. I whispered Joe's name, just trying to see if he was awake. Right after I spoke, I heard a rustling sound in the dark. I looked toward the laundry room, and in the shadows, I saw something moving. Then the laundry room door slowly creaked shut. I panicked. I jumped off the couch and ran over to Joe's couch to wake him up. But when I reached the TV area, the couch was completely empty. Joe was not there. At this point, a wave of relief washed over me. I figured I had worked myself up over nothing. It turns out Joe was obviously trying to play a prank on me. He must have snuck into the laundry room to scare me. I decided to turn the tables on him. I tiptoed over to the laundry room door, keeping as quiet as possible. I was going to open the door and jump out at him first. I put my hand on the doorknob, took a deep breath, and yanked the door open. I ran inside, screaming at the top of my lungs to scare him. I reached over and flipped the light switch. The bright fluorescent light flooded the room. But Joe was not standing there. The room looked empty. I was incredibly confused. I knew he had to be in here. My eyes scanned the small space, and then I noticed something. I looked at the front loading dryer. It had a tinted glass door, making it hard to see inside. But as I got closer, I saw a shape through the glass. I walked over and knelt down to look closer. There was someone crammed inside the dryer, curled up into a tight ball. For a split second, I thought it was Joe, but as my eyes adjusted to the tinted glass, I realized the face looking back at me was not my friend. It was a grown, strange man. He was staring directly at me through the glass. I let out a blood-curdling scream and bolted. I ran out of the laundry room, flew up the basement stairs, and dashed straight into Joe's parents' bedroom, screaming for help. Within seconds, everyone in the house was awake. To my shock, Joe walked out of his bedroom upstairs. It turned out he could not fall asleep on the basement couch, so he had quietly come upstairs to bed hours earlier. I screamed that there was a strange man hiding inside the dryer. Joe's dad immediately bolted down the stairs to the basement, but as he went down, we heard the sound of footsteps pounding through our living room. Someone had run out of the basement, rushed through the main floor, and escaped out the front door. Joe's mom screamed. Joe's dad ran out the front door in his slippers, trying to chase after the intruder, but the man was already gone in the darkness. We called the police right away. When they arrived, they searched the property and asked me if I could describe the man. All I could tell them was that he was wearing dark clothing. We spent the rest of the night locked in Joe's bedroom, sleeping on the floor. It was a long time before we had another sleepover. That kind of terror is something you never really forget. But sometimes, these unsettling encounters happen when you least expect them. Years later, in July of 2013, another terrifying event took place. It was my 13th birthday, and I was so excited. My friends and I had spent the day in Manchester celebrating before heading back to my house for a big sleepover. Since there was not enough room in my bedroom for everyone, we decided to sleep downstairs in the living room. We gathered all of our sleeping bags on the floor, put on some cheesy romantic comedies, and ate junk food. We stayed up laughing and talking until about 1 in the morning. After our third movie ended, we decided it was time to finally go to sleep. We turned off all the lights except for one small lamp. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all a little bit afraid of the dark, so having that one light on made us feel safer. As we lay there in our sleeping bags, we did what kids always do at sleepovers. We kept whispering and chatting, even though we were supposed to be sleeping. We were in the middle of talking about which celebrities we looked like when suddenly, a loud, heavy knock on the window cut through the room. At this point, we all froze. My friend Emma whispered, asking what that noise was. I tried to stay calm and play it cool. I told her it was probably just my dad playing a joke on us. But then, another incredibly loud, forceful knock hit the window. I knew I had to do something to stop the panic. I went over to the window and pulled a small section of the curtains back to look outside. I came face to face with a man who was absolutely not my dad. The man standing on the other side of the glass was bald with thin eyebrows, and he was missing a front tooth. He was hunched over, staring right at me with wide, glassy, unblinking eyes. I let out a terrified scream and slammed the curtains shut. I ran upstairs to find my parents. When I reached the top, I saw my mom standing by her bedroom window, talking to the man outside. He was shouting, asking over and over again if she had seen his friend Paul. My mom told him she had no idea who he was talking about and firmly told him to leave our property. He eventually walked away. But the problem was, my mom wanted to make sure he was actually gone, so she got into her car and drove around the block. As she was driving down the dimly lit street, the exact same bald man suddenly stepped out of the shadows and practically threw himself directly in front of her car. My mom slammed on the brakes, stopping just inches away from hitting him. But before she could open her door, the man scrambled away into the darkness and disappeared. We never saw him again. Sometimes, having a friend with you is the only thing that keeps a bad situation from becoming a complete tragedy. When I was 12 years old, my friend Jake came over to my house for a sleepover on a cold, snowy weekend. The evening started out perfectly normal. We watched Christmas movies in the living room while my mom brought us snacks. Around 10 o'clock, she went upstairs to sleep. By midnight, Jake and I decided to head up to my bedroom, where we played Pokemon on our Game Boys until we fell asleep. A few hours later, I woke up feeling extremely cold and thirsty. I got a glass of water from the kitchen, noticed how freezing the upstairs was, and went back to bed. As I lay there, I heard a deep, heavy breathing sound coming from the room. Thinking it was Jake snoring, I threw a pillow at him and told him to stop breathing so loud. Jake sat up, completely confused, and asked what I was talking about. Then, his eyes drifted down to the empty space directly beneath my bed, and he let out a loud, terrified scream. I looked down and saw a middle-aged man with long hair lying flat on his back under my bed. He put his finger to his lips, shushed me, and whispered that he knew my mom. As he began to crawl out, Jake and I ran screaming to my mom's room and locked the door. The man followed us and aggressively kicked the door, but when my mom called the police, he fled. The police found that he had entered through an open upstairs window. We never found out who he was. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a brief period of time in almost everyone's youth when they experience what it truly means to live alone for the very first time. For me, that happened when I freshly moved out of my parents' house. It was a major milestone, but it also came with a lot of quiet hours. This was right before I met my girlfriend, and before she eventually moved in with me. During this transition, I lived in a small downstairs one-bedroom apartment of someone else's house. The house was split into 2 units, with another tenant living directly above me. Because I did not know many people in the area yet, I spent a massive amount of my time completely alone. When I was not at school or working my shifts, I was usually back in that downstairs apartment. To pass the hours, I watched a lot of movies. Specifically, I really liked watching scary movies. Now, even as a 21-year-old guy, watching these types of films in a quiet, empty apartment late at night has a way of getting under your skin. I would often find myself a little spooked when it came time to turn off the television and try to go to sleep. It is that classic feeling where every little sound makes you pause. Every single time I felt that familiar wave of anxiety, I would sit up and look around the room. At a few points, I would even turn the bedside lamp back on just to reassure myself that nothing was there. On one particular night, the tenant who lived upstairs was not home. I knew this because his car was not parked in the driveway, which was usually a clear indicator of whether he was in or out. Because of this, the sounds I was beginning to hear could not be chalked up to him walking around upstairs. It was well past midnight, and the house should have been dead silent. But my nerves were really starting to set in. I kept hearing these faint, strange noises. To be honest, I could not tell exactly where in the house they were coming from. They did not sound like they were directly above me, nor did they sound like they were coming from the immediate hallway. It was just a series of subtle, unsettling sounds that did not belong in a locked apartment. Eventually, I could not take the suspense anymore. I got out of my bed and made my way over to the bedroom door. I opened it slowly. Outside of my bedroom was a very narrow, dark hallway. If you walked down this hallway, there was a door that led to the bathroom on one side. And then at the very end, the hallway opened up into the kitchen and living room area. I stepped out and looked down that narrow corridor. And right there, like a scene taken directly out of the horror movie I had watched not even an hour earlier, I saw someone. There was a person standing at the far end of the hallway, right by the kitchen entrance. The only light in the apartment was the faint moonlight, filtering in through the bedroom windows behind me and the windows in the living room ahead. It was just enough light for me to make out her figure. It was a woman, and she was looking right back at me. As soon as she realized I had spotted her, she did not run away or scream. Instead, she began to walk backwards. She kept her eyes locked on me, slowly stepping back into the shadow of the kitchen. I did not try to confront her. I was absolutely terrified. I let out a loud scream, backed straight into my bedroom, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and locked it as fast as my hands could move. I stood there with my back pressed against the door, waiting for her to come running down the hall. I expected to hear heavy footsteps, or a frantic pounding on the wood, but none of that happened. Instead, after a few seconds of agonizing silence, I heard the distinct sound of someone running up the half-flight of stairs that led to the main exit of my apartment. Then, the heavy exterior door slammed shut with a loud bang. I was completely frozen in shock. I stood in that exact spot for at least 10 minutes, too terrified to move a single muscle. My heart was hammering against my ribs. When I finally felt my legs would support me, I grabbed my phone and slowly opened the bedroom door to check the rest of the apartment. It did not take very long to search. It was a very small place with very few hiding spots. The rooms were entirely empty. I rushed over to the main entrance and made sure the door was securely locked. I stood there wondering who on earth that woman could have been, and more importantly, how she had managed to get inside my apartment in the first place. I I did not call the police that night. To this day, I cannot really tell you why I did not make that call. I think I was just too overwhelmed and wanted to believe it was some sort of bizarre misunderstanding. The next morning, however, I called my landlord and explained the entire terrifying encounter. The landlord listened carefully and promised to look into it. He made a phone call to the tenant who lived upstairs, and what I learned later that afternoon completely shocked me. It turns out that the woman who had broken into my apartment was an ex-lover of the man who lived upstairs. By all accounts, she was incredibly unstable. She had somehow tracked down his address, but because the house was split into two separate units, she had made a critical error. She had broken into the wrong part of the house. She had walked right into my apartment, thinking she was entering his. The upstairs tenant actually came down to my door that following day to apologize to me in person. He looked embarrassed and deeply stressed, but he did not offer many details about her, and neither did the landlord. They quickly brushed it under the rug. Even now, years later, I still find myself wondering what exactly that woman was planning to do to him that night. She had slipped into a dark home, completely silent, moving through the shadows. If she had been looking for him with those kinds of intentions, I hate to think what would have happened if she had walked up the other set of stairs instead of mine. This next story involves my family, and it is something that still causes a lot of tension and fear whenever I think about it. To be completely honest, I have never been a fan of my dad's girlfriend. Her name is Kathy. Right from the very first day she came into our lives, I had a bad feeling about her. My dad has been widowed since 2019, which was the year our mother passed away. It was a devastating loss for all of us, but especially for my dad. He got incredibly lonely after she was gone, and as the years went on, it became clear that he was pretty much ready to settle down with just about anybody who showed him some attention. That is where Kathy came in. I warned my dad multiple times that something felt incredibly off about her, but he simply would not listen to me. Over the past several months, I have caught her doing some incredibly sketchy things around our house, and it has honestly started to freak me out. To give you some background, I have two younger siblings. There is my 10-year-old brother Jake, and our 2-year-old baby brother Scotty. When my dad first introduced Kathy to the three of us, the very first thing I noticed was her smile. It was not a warm or welcoming smile. It was this unsettlingly wide, exaggerated grin that never seemed to reach her eyes. It felt completely fake, like a mask she was forcing herself to wear. Pretty soon, my dad started bringing her around our house a lot more. Eventually, she practically moved in. The more time she spent with us, the more my dislike for her grew. At first, I kept my distance because I just did not care for her personality. But then, actual events started happening that made me realize my instincts were right. A few weeks ago, my dad was out of the house. I was walking down the hallway and noticed the door to his bedroom closet was slightly ajar. I walked over and saw Kathy standing inside his private closet. This is where my dad keeps his personal safe, along with the combination to it and several other valuable items. She was clearly searching through his things. When she turned and saw me standing in the doorway, she did not look embarrassed or guilty. Instead, she just flashed that incredibly creepy, wide smile and said, "Hey, what is up, sweetie?" I did not want to start a confrontation, so I just mumbled nothing and watched as she shut the closet door. I walked back to my room and immediately called my dad to tell him what I had seen, but he completely brushed it off. He told me I was overreacting and that she was probably just looking for some clothes or helping him organize. A few days after that, another incident occurred. My dad was at work and I had just gotten home from school. As I was walking up the stairs to my bedroom, I saw Kathy stepping out of my 10-year-old brother Jake's room. She quickly shut his bedroom door behind her. I stopped on the stairs and asked her flat out what she was doing in his room when he was not even home. She smiled that same annoying smile and said she was just opening his window because it was getting too hot in the house. I did not say anything back. I just turned and went up to my room. But something about her excuse did not sit right with me. Once I heard her footsteps go back downstairs to the kitchen, I snuck back out of my room and went into Jake's bedroom to check. Sure enough, both of his windows were completely shut and locked tight. She had lied to me. There was absolutely no reason for her to be sneaking around a 10-year-old's room while everyone was away. I knew right then that this lady was up to something bad. I went to me dad again, begging him to see what was happening. But his response was always the same. He asked me to please be patient with the situation. He said he knew I did not care for Kathy, but that I needed to give her a chance. He made me feel like I was the one causing the problems. I decided not to tell Jake about it because I did not want to scare him. But then, fast forward to just 2 days ago. It was an afternoon where Jake, my dad, and I were all out of the house. Kathy was left home alone to babysit 2-year-old Scotty. I ended up coming back home much earlier than expected. I decided to enter the house as quietly as possible. I wanted to be secretive because I was hoping to catch her in the act of doing whatever it was she did when she thought she was completely alone. I snuck through the front door and made my way up to my room without making a single sound. For a few minutes, the house was quiet, but then coming from the kitchen downstairs, I started to hear Scotty crying. It was not his normal fussy cry. It was a very distressed, terrified kind of screaming. And then I heard Kathy. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, telling my 2-year-old brother to shut the blank up. It was a vicious, hateful tone. It was the first time I had ever heard her raise her voice like that, and it was absolutely chilling. In that moment, the fake, sweet mask completely slipped and her true colors came out. I did not hesitate. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could and yelled at her to leave my brother alone. When she saw me stand there, she was completely startled. For the very first time since I had known her, she did not give me that creepy smile. She just stared at me with a completely blank, cold expression. Without saying a single word, she walked past me, went down into the basement, and shut the door behind her. I picked up Scotty, who was shaking, and immediately called my dad to tell him exactly what had happened. That night, when my dad got home, he had a long private conversation with Kathy in their room. I do not know the specifics of how that talk went, but I assume it was not good. Later that night, I went to sleep feeling incredibly uneasy, and in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I opened my eyes and looked into the darkness of my bedroom. There was someone standing inside my room. As soon as they realized I was awake and looking at them, they quickly turned, slipped out of the door, and shut it quietly behind them. My heart began to race. I jumped out of bed, ran to the door, and opened it. As I stepped into the dark hallway, I heard the distinct sound of my dad's bedroom door clicking shut. I marched straight over to his room, threw the door open, and turned on the light. Both Kathy and my dad were laying in the bed. I was furious. I woke my dad up and told him right then and there that Kathy had just been sneaking around inside my bedroom. Kathy immediately denied the whole thing. She put on this sleepy, innocent act and claimed she had been in bed beside him the entire night. My dad looked exhausted and caught in the middle. I do not know if he actually believed me or if he was just trying to keep the peace, but he told me to go back to my room and promised he would talk to her about it. I obeyed and walked back to my room, but as I shut my door, I could hear them whispering in low, tense voices. I went back to my bed, but I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I was terrified. Honestly, I am still terrified. I want her completely out of our house and out of our lives. I truly believe she is a dangerous person. Why was she standing in my dark bedroom while I was asleep? What was she planning to do? I worry for my family's safety every single day now, and I do not know what we can do to make my dad see the truth before it is too late. This next experience goes back a few years to when I was 30 years old. At the time, I was staying at my condominium in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It is a nice place on the second floor of a well-maintained building in a decent part of town. I still own the condo, and I usually head down there during the freezing winter months up north. I am a self-proclaimed beach bum when I am down in Florida, and since I work remotely using my laptop and phone, I can pretty much escape down there whenever I want. Fort Lauderdale is generally a very clean and safe city. The specific neighborhood my building is located in is no exception to that rule. Usually, it is incredibly quiet and peaceful. It was the middle of January, late at night, well past 10 o'clock. I was sitting out on my second floor balcony with my feet propped up on the railing, working on my laptop. The night air was warm, and everything was silent until I suddenly heard a loud voice shouting from the parking lot down below. The voice was yelling, "Yo," and "Hey, you." At first, I did not move or look over the edge. I just assumed whoever was yelling was calling out to a friend or talking to someone else in the parking lot. There was no way they were trying to get my attention. But then, the voice followed up with, "Hey, you up there." My heart skipped a beat. I realized there was no one else out on their balconies. The person was definitely looking at me. I set my laptop down on the chair next to me, stood up, and looked over the railing down to the ground below. There was a man standing in front of a parked car staring directly up at me. He saw me look down and said, "Yeah, you." I was confused, so I just asked, "What is up?" The guy looked up at me and told me to come down there to the parking lot so he could show me something cool. I took a closer, more careful look at him. He was wearing a backwards baseball hat and a tank top. From that distance, I initially assumed he was just some young punk kid trying to mess with people, so I decided the best course of action was to just ignore him. I turned around and sat back down in my chair. As soon as I did that, I heard him burst into a loud, mocking laugh. Then he yelled, "I am gonna come up there and skin you alive, you prick." I immediately stood back up and glared down at him. The man had this incredibly unsettling, sinister smile spread across his face, and as I looked closer, I realized he was much older than I had first thought. He was not a kid. He was a grown man, and he looked completely unhinged. I opened my mouth to shout something angry back at him, but for some reason, my instincts told me to just stop. I realized it was not worth engaging with someone who was clearly unstable. I grabbed my laptop, stepped inside my condo, closed the heavy sliding glass door, and locked it. I stood there for a second, expecting to hear him continue to yell insults up at my balcony. But the parking lot fell completely silent. Even though the interaction had made me incredibly uncomfortable, I felt much safer now that I was locked inside my home. I tried to calm myself down by chalking it up to just another coked-out, Florida lunatic roaming the streets at night. But things went to a terrifying new level just a few minutes later. The dead silence of my living room was suddenly shattered by a massive, violent pounding on my front door. It was accompanied by a raw, angry voice, screaming horrible obscenities and death threats at me. It was the same guy from the parking lot. He had actually come up to the second floor and found my specific unit. The bangs on the door were so incredibly loud and powerful that I was genuinely terrified he was going to break the wooden door right off its hinges. I was too scared to get close to the door, so I just stood in the middle of the room and screamed as loud as I could that I was calling the police. My threat did not seem to faze him at all. Instead of stopping, the sound of his heavy fists pounding on the door suddenly transitioned into these horrific metallic carving and stabbing noises. The entire ordeal probably only lasted for about a minute or two, but in that moment it felt like an absolute eternity. Finally, he gave the door one last, incredibly loud kick, screamed one more vile threat, and then everything went quiet. I waited a moment, holding my breath, before creeping over to the door and looking through the tiny peephole. The hallway was empty. He was gone. I immediately called the police and reported the entire incident. When the officers arrived a short while later, we stepped out into the hallway to examine the front door. There were several deep, jagged stab marks gouged into the wood. It confirmed what I had heard. The man had been actively stabbing at my door, and he was carrying a large knife. I spent the rest of the night praying that nobody else in the building or the area crossed paths with him. I did not know the man, and he certainly did not know me. He was just a highly dangerous, drugged-out stranger looking for a victim to hurt. If I had actually gone down to the parking lot like he asked, I have no doubt I would not be here to tell this story today. This next event in my life is something I am not proud of, but it taught me a massive lesson about who you trust and how easily your private life can be compromised. A few years back, I actually spent a night in jail. I know everyone who has ever been locked up says this, but I truly did not do anything wrong. I was at a popular nightclub in my hometown when I was suddenly confronted and shoved by a massive bouncer. It turned out that a girl I had some complicated history with was also at the club that night. To get back at me, she had lied to the bouncer and claimed that I was touching her and her friends inappropriately. In reality, I had not even spoken a single word to them, but the bouncer did not care to hear my side of the story. He grabbed me and started aggressively shoving me toward the exit. In my drunken state, I got angry and shoved him back. Of course, there were police officers parked right outside the venue. When they saw a physical altercation between a highly intoxicated patron and a sober club employee, they immediately took the bouncer's side. Before I knew what was happening, I was handcuffed, thrown into the back of a patrol car, and escorted to the local jail where I was booked to spend the night. The holding cell was incredibly basic. All it had was a single wooden bench for sitting and sleeping, and I was not alone in there. There was another guy already sitting in the cell. He looked up at me and asked what I was in for. I sighed and told him it was just some absolute nonsense. I took one look at this guy and knew immediately that I did not belong in a place with people like him. He had multiple tattoos covering his face. He was missing one of his front teeth, and he just had this cold, hardened expression that screamed he was not someone you wanted to mess with. I did not want to make him angry or end up in a fight, so I decided to just be polite and chat with him if he spoke to me. As the hours dragged on, my anger over the unfair arrest started to get the better of me. I needed to vent, so I ended up opening up to him quite a bit. Because I was still under the influence of alcohol, I let slip some very specific, delicate information. I told him exactly which neighborhood I was from, which happened to be the very affluent, wealthy side of town. I also bragged about how my parents were currently away on a long vacation and how I had a bunch of friends over at my house earlier that night to pre-game before we headed out to the club. I basically gave this complete stranger a detailed rundown of my entire life and my current home situation. Eventually, I realized I was talking too much and tried to get some sleep. The guy kept trying to keep the conversation going, which was getting highly annoying, but I think he eventually realized I was done talking and finally shut up. The next morning, we were escorted to the local courthouse. Because of the bouncer incident, I was being charged with assault and trespassing, which were two completely bogus charges. My cellmate was also brought into the courtroom for his own hearing. I ended up seeing the judge before him, but he was sitting in the secure offender section at the back of the courtroom, listening to everything. During my hearing, the prosecutor read out my full legal name, and the judge discussed my details before releasing me on my own recognizance with a future court date. It was a complete living nightmare, but I was just glad to finally be going home. That night, I was back at my parents' house. It was a warm evening, so I had opened up almost all the windows on the first floor to let a nice breeze through. I was sitting in the living room trying to relax when I suddenly heard a sound from outside. It was the distinct sound of footsteps. They were circling the perimeter of the house. I stood up, holding my breath, and listened closely. It was not just one person. It sounded like multiple sets of heavy footsteps walking through the grass and leaves. Panic started to set in. I quietly went around the first floor, shutting and locking the windows one by one. Finally, I reached the back of the house where we had a sliding glass door that looked out onto a large wooden deck and the backyard. Feeling a mix of fear and curiosity, I reached over and flicked on the outdoor deck light. Immediately, two men who had been standing right on the deck turned and sprinted away, disappearing into the darkness of the yard. But in the brief second before they ran, the bright light had illuminated their faces perfectly. I recognized one of them. It was my cellmate from the night before. I quickly pulled the blinds shut, checked the lock on the sliding door, and rushed to secure the rest of the house. I was in absolute shock. I could not believe he had actually managed to find my house. But as I thought about it, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place perfectly. I had foolishly told him that I lived in the wealthy part of town, and that my parents were away, leaving the house completely empty. He had heard my unique, full legal name called out in the courtroom. All it took was a quick Google search on a smartphone, and my parents' address would have popped up instantly. He saw an easy opportunity to rob a wealthy home blind, and he had brought an accomplice to help him do it. Thankfully, because I had turned on the light and spotted them, the two men took off and did not attempt to break in again. I stayed awake the entire night, holding a golf club, listening to every single creak of the house. I never ended up telling my parents that I had been arrested, and because of that, I never told them how my jail cellmate almost came and robbed our entire home. It is a terrifying reminder of how a few careless, drunken words to the wrong person can bring danger right to your doorstep. This next story is something that actually happened to me recently, and to be honest, I still do not know how to feel about it, other than completely freaked out. I want to make it clear that I am not a spiritual or superstitious person at all. I usually look for logical explanations for everything. but this particular sequence of events has made me question a lot of things. For a while, I had been on and off with a guy named Spencer. I originally met him through one of my coworkers during a night out at a local bar. We hit it off pretty quickly, and eventually, I decided it was time to introduce him to my family. My parents met him and were mostly indifferent. They did not love him, but they did not hate him either. My grandparents, however, felt very differently. They did not care for Spencer at all. My grandmother, in particular, was very vocal about her dislike. After meeting him a few times at family gatherings, both of my grandparents told me that they saw something bad in him. My grandma kept warning me that he did not seem like a good person, and that I needed to be very careful. At first, I brushed off their concerns as just old-fashioned judgment. But as time went on, I unfortunately started to see exactly what they were talking about. Spencer and I started getting into constant, toxic arguments. He had a very short fuse, and he would lose his temper over the smallest things, often shouting at me and making me feel incredibly small. Because of his anger issues, we were constantly breaking up and getting back, of course. Then came one night where we got into a massive fight, and the look in his eyes made me feel like he was actually about to raise his hand and hit me. He ended up holding himself back and eventually calmed down, but that was the final straw for me. I told him we were completely done, and I walked away. My grandmother was especially happy to hear this news. She told me I deserved much better, and she went on and on about how I should find a nice boy from a good, loving family who would treat me with respect. Not long after that conversation, my grandmother unexpectedly suffered a massive heart attack and passed away. Our entire family was devastated. During my intense grieving process, I decided to hang a beautiful framed picture of my grandmother on the wall of my bedroom as a way to honor her memory. That was about a month ago. I had been having an absolutely horrible, emotionally exhausting month. And in a moment of weakness and loneliness 2 weeks ago, when Spencer reached out to me to apologize, I actually answered his call. We started talking again, and we ended up seeing each other every single night for those 2 weeks. I really wanted to believe he had changed. He was on his absolute best behavior. We did not argue a single time, and for the first time in a long time, I actually felt safe and happy around him. Well, just a few days ago, Spencer and I were hanging out in my room, and we officially agreed to give our relationship another real chance and become boyfriend and girlfriend again. He left later that evening, and I went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I was suddenly jolted awake by a loud, violent crashing sound right inside my bedroom. I panicked, sat up, and quickly reached over to flick on my bedside lamp. It took my eyes a moment to adjust to the light, but as I looked around the room, I immediately noticed that something was missing. The framed picture of my grandmother was no longer hanging on the wall. I got out of my bed and walked over. The heavy wooden frame had fallen straight down to the floor, and the glass was completely shattered and cracked right across her face. It occurred to me right then. The picture frame that had been securely hung on my wall for a month had fallen and broken on the exact night I had made the decision to get back together with Spencer. I picked up the broken frame in my hands. My heart was pounding in my throat, and my entire body was shaking uncontrollably. It felt like an undeniable physical warning. The very next morning, I called Spencer and told him that we needed to go our separate ways. I lied and said my head just was not in the right place because of my grief. As soon as those words left my mouth, Spencer completely lost control. He began screaming at me over the phone, calling me horrible names and showing an absolute fury that was terrifying to hear. That single phone call proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that my grandmother had been entirely right about him all along. But I still cannot stop thinking about that picture frame. There were no open windows, and there was absolutely no draft in my room that night. The hook was still firmly in the wall. Even as a skeptic, I cannot help but feel like it was a protective sign from my grandma. And honestly, realizing how close I came to letting that dangerous man back into my life is incredibly scary. This next story takes place out in the wilderness, where help is often miles away, and you are entirely dependent on your own wits to survive. I own a Jeep, and a few years ago, I decided to take it on a solo road trip out to Colorado to do some off-roading. I spent several days exploring the beautiful, rugged trails around the Red Feather Lakes area. To end my final night of the trip, I decided to tackle the famous Dead Man's Road Trail. It was a moderately challenging route, but the high-altitude scenery was absolutely unbeatable. I had packed a heavy sleeping bag and planned to just sleep in the back of my Jeep with the rear seats folded down. As the sun began to set, I pulled off the main trail into a slightly cleared area. I did this to ensure that on the off chance another night driver came along, I would not be blocking the path. Though, to be honest, the chances of anyone else driving this deep into the woods at night were incredibly slim. Some people might find it weird that I enjoy off-roading and camping entirely on my own, but I have always been a solo adventurer. I liked the peace and quiet of the forest. I set up my sleeping bag in the back of the vehicle, which I considered to be a bit of luxury camping compared to sleeping on the hard ground in a tent. For dinner, I just ate some protein bars and snacks that I had brought along in my cooler. To give you a visual, I was not doing all of this in total darkness. I had a massive high-powered LED light bar mounted to the front of my Jeep. When I turned it on, it completely illuminated the entire surrounding forest with a bright white light. Eventually, I crawled into my sleeping bag. It is definitely not the most comfortable setup, but it was a small price to pay to be able to wake up right at sunrise in the middle of the beautiful Colorado mountains. I made sure all of the windows were rolled up tight to keep any bugs from getting inside, but because of how quiet the wilderness is, I could still hear every single sound from the woods outside. And then the silence was broken. I heard a distinct voice coming from somewhere out in the dark woods. It was immediately followed by a short, loud burst of laughter. My heart instantly sank. I was miles deep into a challenging off-road trail. There was absolutely no way someone was just casually taking a stroll out there, especially not in the pitch-black night. I sat up and stared out the windows, expecting to see the headlights of another vehicle, or maybe the glow of a flashlight, but there was nothing. Just total oppressive darkness beyond the reach of my Jeep's lights. Then I heard the voice again. This time it was much clearer, though I still could not tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. My hands began to shake. Someone was definitely out there in the trees, watching me. I lay as still as possible, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. For a long time there was nothing but the sound of the crickets. But then, coming from a position that was much closer to my Jeep, I heard a clear, youthful voice. It sounded like either a woman or a young boy. The voice said, "Hello, I see you there." I was so terrified I felt like I was going to throw up. Every instinct in my body told me to climb into the driver's seat and start the engine, but I was literally paralyzed with fear. I had this irrational thought that if I just stayed perfectly still and did not move, whoever was out there would think the Jeep was empty and go away. I was clinging to any shred of hope that this was not actually happening. Suddenly, there was a massive, violent bang on my rear windshield. The impact was so loud it sounded like a heavy rock, or a fist had slammed into the glass. I gasped, jumped up, and practically dove over the center console. Throwing myself into the front driver's seat, I jammed the key into the ignition, started the engine, threw the Jeep into drive, and hit the gas. I drove down the rocky, uneven trail as fast as I possibly could, desperately trying not to lose control on the dangerous terrain. I was terrified that whoever was out there was running alongside the vehicle, trying to grab the door handles. I was too scared to look in my rearview mirror, but when I finally gathered the courage to glance back, all I could see was the empty, dark trail illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. It was an absolute living nightmare. I was exhausted, but there was no way I was stopping. I drove the remaining miles of the trail until the tires finally hit asphalt. I kept driving for hours until I finally spotted a motel, where I checked in for the rest of the night. Some people have asked me if it could have just been a stranded hiker who was lost and looking for help. But I know that is not the case. Nobody wanders around deep in the mountains past midnight, in the pitch black, laughing mockingly without a flashlight. And they certainly do not slam their fist onto a stranger's window like that, unless they are trying to terrify them. There are some incredibly sick people in this world, and that night taught me to always watch my back, no matter how far into the wilderness I go. This next experience is one of the few completely unexplainable events I have ever had to deal with in my life. I was at home, upstairs in my bedroom, focusing on writing a major research paper for my high school history class. As far as I knew, I was completely alone in the house. My dad was at work, and my mom had gone out to run some errands, But apparently, I was mistaken. Suddenly, I heard my mom's voice call out from downstairs. She was loudly calling my name. I stopped typing and yelled back, "What?" There was no answer. I waited for a second, but when she did not reply, I got slightly annoyed. I was in the middle of a good writing flow and did not want to be interrupted, so I reluctantly pushed my chair back, got up, and made my way downstairs to see what she wanted. When I reached the main floor, I walked into the kitchen and living room, but my mom was nowhere to be seen. I raised my voice and yelled, "Mom!" Immediately, her voice called back my name. The sound clearly came from down in the basement. I walked over to the basement door and opened it. Strangely, the basement lights were completely turned off. It was pitch black down there. I called down the dark stairs, "Mom," and again her voice called my name right back. I stood at the top of the stairs. Feeling a sudden wave of unease, I yelled, "What are you doing down there with the lights off?" There was no response. I reached over and flicked on the light switch, illuminating the wooden stairs, and began to slowly walk down. As I neared the bottom of the steps, I heard her call my name once more, but this time it sent a shiver down my spine. I realized that each time my voice had called out, her response was exactly the same. The pitch, the tone, and the speed of how she said my name had zero variation. It sounded like a recording being played back to me. I stepped onto the basement floor and called out, "Mom?" And like clockwork, the exact same voice called my name back. The basement was open, and I could clearly see that she was not standing in any of the main areas. But then my eyes landed on the small crawl space closet door. It was standing wide open. This closet was a strange, low-ceiling space that took up a large portion of the understair storage. It was the only possible place left in the basement where someone could be hiding. I walked a few steps closer and said, "Mom," one final time. This time, there was absolutely no answer. I got down on my knees in front of the open crawl space door and tried to peer into the darkness inside. It was completely black, and the air coming out of it felt freezing cold. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I said, "Mom, are you messing with me?" No response. The only sound in the entire basement was the low, electric buzzing of the overhead fluorescent light. Suddenly, my survival instincts kicked in. Without thinking, I scrambled backwards, stood up, and sprinted up the basement stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. I slammed the heavy basement door shut and threw the lock. My heart was hammering in my chest. I grabbed the landline phone and dialed my mom's cell phone number with shaking fingers. She picked up on the third ring. I could hear the noisy background of a supermarket. I asked her where she was, and she told me she was currently at the grocery store on the other side of town and had been there for the last 45 minutes. I started crying and told her what had just happened in our basement. Of course, she did not believe me. She thought I was just playing a cruel joke on her to get her to come home. It took me begging and sobbing for half an hour before she realized I was truly terrified. When she and my dad finally got home, the three of us went down to the basement together. My dad was holding a heavy flashlight. The crawl space closet door was still standing wide open, just as I had left it. My dad crawled inside and searched every single corner of the space, but it was completely empty. To this day, I have absolutely no logical explanation for what I heard that afternoon. It remains the most haunting, chilling experience of my entire life. Back in the year 2014, my life was in a bit of a transition phase, mostly because of a really stupid mistake I had made. I had recently been charged with a DUI, which meant I lost my driver's license for a solid 12 months. It was an incredibly frustrating and sobering experience, but I had no one to blame but myself. Since I could not drive, I found myself relying heavily on a relatively new app at the time called Uber. It was my lifeline for getting to work, buying groceries, and occasionally going out on weekends. In my town, there was this popular nightclub and bar where my friends and I would always gather. On most weekends, we would head out there to unwind. If we were lucky, one of us would act as the designated driver, but more often than not, we would just end up catching an Uber back home. On this particular night, however, things did not go according to our usual plan. I had arrived at the club with my friends, but by the time midnight rolled around, I started feeling pretty unwell. My stomach was upset, and the loud music and flashing lights were just making me feel worse. I decided to head home early, leaving my friends behind to keep partying. It was somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning when I walked out of the club. The air outside was absolutely freezing, the kind of deep winter cold that bites right through your jacket and makes your teeth chatter. Walking home was completely out of the question because I lived several miles away. I pulled out my phone with shivering fingers and opened up the Uber app to request a ride. Almost immediately, a driver named Alex popped up on my screen. He was only about 2 miles away, which meant I wouldn't have to wait long in the freezing cold. I tapped on his profile to check his details, and I have to admit, his picture made me feel a little uneasy. He looked older, maybe in his late 50s, and he had this very stern, unsmiling expression. He wore a black beanie cap pulled low over his forehead, and he had a thick, grayish goatee. He looked pretty creepy, but I brushed the feeling off. I told myself I was just being paranoid because I was tired and sick. Besides, the app showed he drove a Chevy Malibu, which sounded like a decent, reliable car. I requested the ride and stood on the sidewalk to wait. To stay out of the biting wind, I sat down on a concrete bench right next to the club's entrance. The bouncer was standing right beside me, completely still like a stone statue with his hands folded in front of him. We didn't talk, both of us just staring out into the dark, quiet street. About 5 minutes later, a silver car pulled up to the curb. My heart sank a little bit when I saw it. This was not the nice, modern Chevy Malibu I had pictured. It was an old, beat-up model, probably from around 2003. The paint was faded, the bumper was dented, and it just looked incredibly ratty. The driver didn't flash his headlights, he didn't honk his horn, and he didn't call out my name. He just sat there idling by the curb, waiting. I stood up, said a quick goodbye to the silent bouncer, and walked over to the car. I opened the rear door and climbed into the back seat. Immediately, the atmosphere inside the car felt incredibly heavy and uncomfortable. The driver, Alex, didn't turn around to greet me. He didn't say hello, he didn't ask how my night was going, and he didn't even look at me through the rearview mirror. He just stared straight ahead through the windshield. After a few seconds of dead silence, he spoke in a very low, quiet voice. He simply asked, "Where you headed to?" I gave him my home address, and he put the car in drive, pulling away from the curb. We started driving down Main Street, but within a minute, I realized we were heading in the completely wrong direction. My house was to the south, but he was driving north. I cleared my throat and told him that he was going the wrong way. Without saying a word, he turned left at the next intersection. But instead of getting back on the main roads that would lead to my house, he started navigating through quiet, dark residential areas. I watched him closely and noticed that he didn't have his phone mounted on the dashboard. In fact, he wasn't using any GPS at all. This made me feel extremely strange. I couldn't tell if he expected me to give him turn-by-turn directions, or if he had something else in mind. To ease my anxiety, I pulled out my own phone, opened up my map app, and entered my home address. I turned the volume up all the way so the GPS voice would speak loudly, hoping he would follow the instructions. As we approached the next street, the GPS voice clearly instructed to turn left, but Alex completely ignored it and drove straight past the intersection. I made a confused hand gesture in the back seat, hoping he would see me in his mirror. He did notice. He glanced back quickly and said, "I just have to make a quick stop, don't worry. I will give you a discount on the ride." Even though I had been drinking earlier, the sudden rush of adrenaline completely cleared my mind. I knew right then that something was terribly wrong. That was the exact moment my eyes drifted down to the center console. Right next to his seat, sticking out of the open middle glove box, was the black grip of a handgun. My heart stopped. I stared at the weapon, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I needed to get out of this car immediately. We were approaching a red light, and I realized this might be my only chance. I waited until the car came to a complete stop. Very slowly and quietly, I reached my hand down and gripped the door handle. The handle moved smoothly, but the door itself remained firmly shut, completely sealed against the frame. I tried again, pushing my shoulder hard against the door panel, but it wouldn't budge. My stomach dropped as the chilling realization hit me. The child lock on the rear passenger door was fully engaged, and I was completely trapped. At this point, pure panic set in. My heart was pounding so hard I was worried he would hear it. Alex kept driving, taking us further and further away from my home. By my estimation, we had crossed into the next town, and then the town after that. We were in a completely unfamiliar area, surrounded by dark roads and empty buildings. I couldn't pull out my phone to call the police because I was terrified of how he would react if he saw me dialing 911. He had a gun right next to him, and I was trapped in the back seat. I had to figure out a way to unlock that door myself. I knew that the controls for the child locks on older cars were usually located on the driver's door panel or the center console. I realized my only option was to slide across the back seat and position myself directly behind him. If I could get close enough, I might be able to reach forward and flick the lock switch when he wasn't looking. This was easily the most terrifying moment of my life. I stared intensely at the back of his head, watching his reflection in the rearview mirror. I waited until his eyes were focused on the road ahead. Then, as gently and silently as possible, I slid my body across the leather seat until I was sitting directly behind him. He didn't seem to notice. I waited for the next red light, knowing I had to time my move perfectly. We drove for several more minutes, the tension building inside me, until I felt like I was going to throw up. Finally, the light ahead turned yellow, and Alex began to slow the car down. We stopped at a relatively large intersection. It was late, but there was another car stopped on the opposite side of the road, which gave me a tiny sliver of hope. I took a deep breath, gathered every ounce of courage I had, and lunged forward. I reached my arm over the front seat and slammed my finger onto the glowing door lock button on his panel. The sudden movement startled him completely. Alex literally jumped 2 inches out of his seat and let out a loud, angry scream. Just as I had feared, his hand immediately reached down toward the glove box where the gun was resting. But I didn't hesitate. The moment I heard the click of the locks opening, I grabbed my door handle, threw the door open, and scrambled out of the car. I stumbled onto the cold asphalt, my legs shaking violently. I ran as fast as I could toward the other car at the intersection, a large Cadillac Escalade. I began banging desperately on their passenger window, screaming for help. To my absolute horror, the driver of the Escalade looked at me with a face full of fear, hit the gas, and sped away, leaving me stranded in the middle of the dark intersection. I spun around, expecting Alex to be right behind me with the gun, but to my surprise, he had decided not to pursue me. He had floored the Malibu and was already speeding away down the block, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. I ran to a nearby 24-hour grocery store, my heart still hammering in my chest. I walked inside, shivering uncontrollably under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. The cashier gave me a strange, concerned look, probably because I was pale, gasping for breath, and looked like I had just seen a ghost. I stood near the entrance, trying to stop my hands from shaking, and called a traditional taxi service to pick me up and take me home. The sheer terror of the situation had completely sobered me up. When I got home, I immediately reported the incident to Uber. They took my statement and told me they would escalate the situation to the police. However, it took a full week before an officer finally showed up at my house to ask me a few basic questions. I never found out what happened to Alex, or if he was ever arrested. All I know is that I uninstalled the app that very night, and I have never stepped foot inside an Uber since. But dangerous encounters on rideshare apps don't just happen to passengers. Sometimes, the person behind the wheel is the one who ends up fighting for their life. A few years after my experience, an 18-year-old named Marcus was working as an Uber driver in a different part of the country. Marcus was a skinny kid, and his parents had recently bought him a brand new Honda Accord. Because Marcus was so young and physically small, his father was constantly worried about his safety. Before Marcus started driving for Uber, his dad handed him a small pocket knife and told him to keep it in the side compartment of his seat. His dad had heard too many local news stories about rideshare drivers getting set up, robbed, or worse in the middle of the night. He wanted Marcus to have some form of defense, even if it was small. Marcus didn't really think he would ever actually need to use it, but he kept the blade hidden away there anyway, just to give his dad some peace of mind. It was a freezing Friday night in December, easily one of the coldest nights of the winter. Marcus was bored and decided to log onto the app to make some extra money doing late-night pickups. Around midnight, a request came in from a user named Tom. The pickup location was only a couple of miles away, situated near a major shopping center. Marcus accepted the ride and drove over. When he arrived, he saw a group of rowdy teenagers hanging out near the entrance of the shopping center. They looked like they were looking for trouble, and Marcus prayed that his passenger wasn't one of them. He drove slowly past them, feeling their eyes on his brand new car. Wanting to avoid any conflict, Marcus drove further into the empty parking lot, away from the teenagers. He did 2 slow laps around the dark shopping center, looking for anyone who might be his passenger. Finally, as he checked his left side mirror, he saw a lone figure walking quickly toward his car from behind. Marcus rolled down his window and called out the name Tom. The man stopped and called back, "Yes." Marcus unlocked the doors and told him to hop in, but the man just stood there looking confused. Marcus had to repeat himself 3 times, speaking loudly and clearly, before the man finally understood and walked around to the passenger side, instead of sitting in the front or diagonally in the back, which is what most passengers did. Tom opened the rear door and climbed into the seat directly behind Marcus. This immediately made Marcus incredibly uncomfortable. Having a complete stranger sit directly behind your head makes it impossible to keep an eye on them. As soon as Tom closed the door, the small space inside the Honda Accord filled with the heavy, stale smell of cigarette smoke. Marcus looked at him in the mirror. Tom looked to be in his late 40s, with a rough, weathered face. Marcus asked him for his destination, and Tom mumbled an address. Marcus entered it into his phone. It was a 10-mile drive, which meant a good payout, but Marcus already had a bad feeling about this guy. Marcus tried to start some friendly small talk to ease the tension, but Tom was completely unresponsive. Whenever Marcus asked a simple question, Tom would either mumble incoherently or just remain completely silent. After a few minutes of getting nothing but cold, dry responses, Marcus gave up and stopped talking. The silence in the car became deafening. By the time they reached the 6-mile mark, Marcus felt a heavy sense of dread settling in his stomach. He was terrified to look in his rearview mirror because he was certain Tom was staring at him. He finally mustered the courage to take a quick glance. He was right. Tom was sitting perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the back of Marcus's neck. Marcus's body reacted instantly to the fear. His foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, wanting to speed up and get this ride over with as fast as possible. By the 8th mile, the surroundings changed drastically. They had left the populated areas behind, and were now driving through a completely deserted stretch of road. There was nothing but thick, dark woods on either side of the asphalt, with only the occasional abandoned building passing by. Marcus looked down at his phone map to see where this address actually was. He dragged his finger across the screen and realized with a jolt of panic that the destination was at the very end of a dead-end street, miles away from any main roads. With his heart hammering against his ribs, Marcus decided to ask Tom if this address was actually his house. He waited in the quiet car, but there was no response. 5 seconds passed in complete silence. Finally, Tom answered in a flat, chilling voice, "Yes." They were less than a mile away now, surrounded by pitch-black woods. Marcus approached the turn for the dead-end street and slowed down, shining his headlights into the darkness. There were no streetlights, no houses, and no signs of life. It was just a black void. Marcus knew that if he drove down that road, he would be completely isolated. He made a split-second decision to pretend he had missed the turn, hoping to keep driving toward a safer area. But the moment he passed the street, Tom sat forward and yelled at him to turn around. The aggression in Tom's voice made Marcus realize his life was in serious danger. He apologized, made a quick 3-point turn, and headed back toward the dead-end road. As he turned the car onto the dark street, Marcus quietly slipped his right hand into the netting compartment on the side of his seat. His fingers wrapped around the handle of his father's pocket knife. He quietly flicked the blade open, holding it tightly in his grip, hidden from view. He drove to the very end of the road where the headlights revealed nothing but a wall of thick trees. The car came to a stop. Marcus held his breath, waiting for whatever was about to happen. Tom spoke up, his voice suddenly shifting to a soft, almost polite tone. He thanked Marcus for the ride and opened his door, but instead of stepping out, Tom paused. He looked at Marcus and asked if he could get out of the car to help him carry his bag, claiming he had a bad back. But Marcus knew for a fact that Tom didn't have a bag. He had got into the car with absolutely nothing. Marcus tried to keep his voice steady, telling Tom that he would be right out to help him, but the trembling in his voice was undeniable. Before Marcus could even put the car in park, he felt a sudden violent pressure wrap around his throat. Tom had lunged forward from the back seat, wrapping his thick arms around Marcus's neck. cutting off his airway. Marcus couldn't breathe. Instinct took over. Without a second thought, Marcus brought his right hand up and drove the open blade of the knife directly into Tom's left arm. Tom let out a horrific scream of pain and instantly released his grip on Marcus's neck. He scrambled backward, threw the door open, and fell out of the car onto the cold pavement. Marcus didn't waste a single second. He slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, spinning the steering wheel, and floored it back down the dark, dead-end road. He didn't stop driving until he reached a brightly lit, busy highway. Marcus was so terrified and traumatized by the attack that he didn't even call the police. He just drove straight home, locked his doors, and tried to sleep. The very next day, Marcus officially resigned as an Uber driver, never wanting to risk his life behind the wheel for a stranger ever again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine you are doing a favor for your family, expecting a quiet and peaceful weekend, only to find yourself trapped in a real-life nightmare. It was a warm summer weekend when a young man decided to watch over his grandmother's house. She was 75 years old, and she had planned a wonderful trip to Florida with a group of her close friends from church. Since she was going to be gone for several days, she did not want her home sitting completely empty, so she asked her grandson if he would mind staying there. He happily agreed. He packed up a small bag of clothes and drove over to her house, ready for a relaxing weekend of watching television and sleeping in. When he arrived, the house felt comforting and familiar. He decided to sleep in the guest bedroom, which was located right next to his grandmother's master bedroom. This guest bedroom had 2 twin beds inside of it, and it brought back a lot of old memories. When he and his brother were younger, they would always sleep in these exact twin beds whenever they had sleepovers at their grandmother's house. For nostalgic reasons, he chose the bed right next to the window. But before he got into bed for the night, he decided to do a quick sweep of the house. He walked through the quiet hallways, checking the front door, the back door, and all the window locks to make sure everything was completely secure. Once he was satisfied that the house was locked up tight, he finally climbed into bed. It was still relatively early, and he was not feeling very tired yet, so he lay there on his phone. He spent about an hour or two scrolling through social media, watching videos, and texting his friends. The house was dead silent, save for the occasional creaks of the old wood. But then, right around midnight, the silence was broken. He thought he could hear a faint, distant sound coming from outside. He paused his video and listened closely. It sounded like a human voice. It was a woman's voice, and she was softly saying the word, "Hello." He froze in bed, his heart rate starting to speed up. He slowly slipped out of the covers and opened the guest bedroom door. He began to inch his way down the dark hallway, moving as quietly as possible so he could hear where the sound was coming from. The voice was repeating itself. Every 10 seconds or so, a woman's voice would drift through the air, saying hello. As he approached the front door, he realized the sound was coming from right outside the entryway. The problem was that his grandmother's heavy wooden front door did not have a peephole. He could not see who was standing on the porch without opening the door, which he absolutely did not want to do. However, he remembered that the dining room windows offered a clear view of the front porch. He walked over to the dining room, trying to make absolutely no sound on the hardwood floors. He reached the window and tried to peek his head in between plastic blinds, without making it obvious that he was looking. But he did a poor job of being stealthy. When he looked through the small gap in the blinds, his eyes locked onto a woman standing on the front porch. She was staring directly at the window, right back at him, as if she knew exactly where he would be looking. She had a strange, freakish smile stretched across her face, and she said, "Hello." Once again, the woman was older, maybe in her late 50s or early 60s, but she did not look like an innocent, sweet grandmother. There was something deeply unsettling about her face that completely skeeved him out. He quickly stepped away from the window, his mind racing. He wondered if this could be one of his grandmother's friends from church who did not know she was in Florida. But that made no sense. It was midnight. Why would anyone show up at this hour? And why was she not knocking on the door or ringing the doorbell? Instead, she was just standing there on the dark porch, smiling and repeating the word hello. Deeply unsettled, he decided to go back to the guest bedroom. He shut the door tightly, hoping that if he ignored her, she would eventually walk away. With the bedroom door shut, he could no longer hear her voice. He sat on the bed and began texting his sisters and his friends, telling them about the bizarre and creepy situation he was dealing with. After a while, the silence returned, and he slowly began to calm down. His sisters texted him back, telling him that he should call their grandmother to ask if she knew who this woman might be. But he knew there was no way his grandmother would be awake at this hour, and she rarely checked her cell phone anyway, so he decided against it. Just as he was starting to feel safe again, a sudden violent noise shattered the quiet night. It was a loud, aggressive banging sound coming from the guest bedroom window. It was not a gentle knock or a polite tap. Someone was slamming their hands against the glass. He felt a sharp, fierce pain in his chest as his body instantly went into a full fight or flight response. The banging stopped, and then, from just outside the thin window pane, he heard that same familiar voice say, "Hello." Fueled by a sudden rush of adrenaline, he felt a burst of confidence. He marched over to the window, grabbed the plastic blinds, and shoved them upward. He found himself face to face with the terrifying older woman. There was only a thin pane of glass separating them. He stared at her gross, smiling face, and screamed that he was calling the cops. He pulled the blinds back down, ran out of the room, and bolted up the stairs to the second floor. He decided to lock himself in the upstairs guest bedroom, hiding under the covers. He did not actually call the police, as he hoped she would just leave if he stayed hidden. A few hours later, he finally gathered the courage to go downstairs and peer out the windows. The woman was finally gone. The next morning, he called his grandmother and told her everything that had happened. The moment he finished speaking, his grandmother began to panic and yell into the phone. She was clearly distressed. She explained that just a few days before she left for Florida, she was at the local grocery store when she realized she was being watched. A woman who looked about 10 years younger than her had followed her through the aisles, staring and smiling at her for absolutely no reason. He tried to calm his grandmother down, not knowing if the two events were truly connected, but it gave him chills. His grandmother was 75 and sometimes lost her wits, but the pure terror in her voice made him believe that the strange smiling woman had actually targeted her home. Now, let us fast forward to another unsettling encounter, this one involving a college student named Nicholas. Nicholas was a young freshman studying at Syracuse University. If you know anything about the area around Syracuse, you know that it is not always the safest place, especially when you wander off campus at night. Nicholas had recently gone through a painful breakup with his first serious girlfriend, and after spending some time recovering, he decided it was time to get back into the dating scene. He decided to download the dating app Hinge to see if he could meet anyone interesting. It did not take long before he matched with a blonde girl named Stephanie. As they began texting back and forth, Nicholas felt a genuine connection. She also went to Syracuse University, and they had a surprising amount of things in common. They both loved to read, they enjoyed going to the movies, and they shared the exact same dry sense of humor. After a few days of constant messaging, Nicholas suggested that they should go on a movie date together. Stephanie replied that she would love to go. However, instead of meeting at the theater, she told him to meet her at a specific spot just off campus, and she would pick him up in her car. Around 9 o'clock that evening, Nicholas walked to the designated corner of a quiet residential neighborhood block. He stood under the dim glow of a streetlight, waiting for Stephanie to arrive. While he was waiting, he received a message from her, asking him to share his live location with her so she could see exactly where he was standing. Without thinking much of it, he clicked the share button and sent his location. A few minutes later, he saw a car turn down the street and begin slowly driving toward him. The car pulled up to the curb and came to a stop right in front of him. But when the driver rolled down the window, Nicholas realized something was very wrong. The person behind the wheel was not a young blonde college girl. It was a random, middle-aged man. The man looked out at Nicholas and asked him what he was doing, standing all alone on the street corner at night. Nicholas felt a wave of confusion and suspicion, but he calmly replied that he was waiting for someone. The man then asked him if he was waiting for Stephanie. Nicholas was taken aback. He asked how the man could possibly know that. The man smiled and claimed that he was actually Stephanie's father. He told Nicholas to hop into the passenger seat so he could drive him to meet up with her. Nicholas took a close look at the man's face. He looked far too old to be Stephanie's father, and the entire situation felt incredibly sketchy. Nicholas was no idiot, and he knew that getting into a stranger's car on a dark street was a recipe for disaster. In a firm, confident voice, Nicholas asked the man why Stephanie had not mentioned that her father would be the one picking him up. The man quickly claimed that he did not trust random guys meeting up with his daughter, and he simply wanted to meet Nicholas first to make sure he was safe. Nicholas stared at the man for a brief moment, decided he was not going to take any chances, and simply turned around and walked away in the opposite direction. The man in the car seemed completely surprised by this. He began yelling after Nicholas, telling him to come back, but Nicholas kept walking. He heard the car's engine rev behind him, and he glanced over his shoulder to make sure the man was not spinning the car around to follow him. To his relief, the car continued straight down the street, turned left, and disappeared from sight. Nicholas breathed a sigh of relief and continued his walk back toward the safety of the campus. He reached the corner of the block and was about to make a turn when he noticed a car parked on the side of the road with its headlights turned completely off. As he walked past it, he realized it was the exact same car the older man had been driving. The windows were heavily tinted, making it impossible to see who was sitting inside. Nicholas tried his best to act natural and not show that he was suspicious, keeping his eyes forward as he kept walking. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from the person claiming to be Stephanie. The text asked why he had not gotten into the car with her dad. Nicholas decided to completely ignore the message. He kept walking, occasionally looking back to see if the dark car was moving. When he reached a major intersection, he turned the corner and immediately began sprinting as fast as he could toward the campus. He finally made it back to the university grounds, completely out of breath. He began walking toward his dorm building, trying to calm his racing heart. But as he walked down a quieter path, he felt like he could hear the sound of footsteps behind him. He tried to convince himself that he was just being paranoid after what had happened. But then, he heard the distinct sound of a shoe kicking a piece of broken glass on the pavement. He knew for an absolute fact that he was being followed. He quickly ducked behind a parked van, crouched down and listened. He heard the footsteps getting closer, coming from between the parked cars across from him. He suddenly realized a terrifying mistake he had made. He had never stopped sharing his live location with the Stephanie profile. The person on the other end of the app knew his exact coordinates, tracking his movements in real time. Looking out from behind the van, he saw the older man approaching. The man yelled out to him, saying that he should come back, and that he would take him to see Stephanie. Nicholas knew there was no way a man in his 60s could outrun a healthy college freshman. He stood up and bolted, sprinting all the way back to his dorm room. When he arrived, his roommate was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He collapsed onto his bed, trying to process the danger he had just escaped. A moment later, his phone buzzed again with a text from the number. The message was shockingly hostile. The man wrote that Nicholas was a little piece of garbage, that he was lucky he got away, and that he would have strangled his ugly face. Nicholas sat there in shock, realizing how close he had come to being abducted or worse. He replied to the message, stating that he was saving the screenshots and taking them straight to the police, and then he blocked the number. Our final story takes us back to when another young man was 18 years old, working a summer job that turned into a terrifying game of hide-and-seek. He was employed as a part-time janitor at his local high school during the summer months. His hours varied greatly depending on how much money he wanted to make. Some days he would work the morning shift starting at 9, and other times he would work the night shift, staying all the way until midnight. Because it was the summer, the school was mostly empty, and he was often left alone to lock up the building after the older full-time janitors went home. At the time, the high school had not yet installed security cameras in the hallways, leaving many blind spots throughout the massive building. One night, his supervisor, a man named Tom, had to leave the shift early to take care of some personal business. This meant the 18-year-old would be finishing up the final hours of his shift completely alone, and he would be responsible for locking all the doors and setting the alarms. Tom told him to text him if he ran into any issues, and then he left. The young man actually enjoyed being left alone, because it meant he could finish his work quickly and then spend the rest of his shift relaxing on his phone, or even leaving early while still getting paid. Before Tom left, he had given him one final task. He needed to take a large stack of extra metal chairs that had been used for an assembly in the gymnasium and move them down to the basement storage room. The young man figured he would get this chore done quickly so he could go home. He picked up a stack of 6 heavy chairs and began carrying them down the concrete stairs into the basement. The basement of the high school was not a pleasant place. It was dimly lit, cold, and felt more like an abandoned warehouse than a school facility. The storage room was filled with old school equipment, including several large art mannequins that were draped in dusty white paint cloths. These cloths looked like giant blankets, completely covering the figures. All of the school's extra art supplies were kept down here, and the atmosphere was naturally creepy. He set his first stack of chairs down in the designated corner and headed back up to the gym to grab more. A few minutes later, he returned to the basement carrying another stack of chairs. But as he walked into the storage room, he froze. One of the art mannequins in the front row was completely exposed. The large white cloth that had been covering it just minutes before had been pulled off and was now lying on the floor. He knew with absolute certainty that the mannequin had been covered when he was down here just moments ago. Panic began to set in. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Tom, telling him that he thought someone was down in the basement with him. Tom replied a moment later, asking what he meant. The young man explained that one of the art cloths had been moved. Tom took a minute to respond, finally texting back that no one else was supposed to be in the building. As the young man stood there reading the text, his eyes wandered to a dark corner of the storage room, just outside the reach of the dim overhead light. He noticed a large art cloth piled in the shadows, but as he stared at it, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The cloth was covering something, and that something was moving. It was a subtle, slow-shifting motion, as if someone was crouching underneath it, trying to stay perfectly still. There was undoubtedly a person hiding under that sheet. Terrified, the young man spun around, sprinted up concrete stairs, and slammed the basement door shut, locking it from the outside. He immediately texted Tom, telling him that someone was definitely hiding under a cloth in the basement, and that he was going to call the police. But Tom did not want to deal with the hassle of a police investigation. He texted back, telling the young man to be a man and go back down there to confront whoever it was, suggesting it was probably just a kid pulling a prank. Reluctantly, the young man unlocked the door and crept back down the stairs. When he reached the storage room, he saw that the cloth was now lying flat on the floor. Whoever had been hiding under it was gone. But then, the most terrifying moment of the night occurred. As he stood in the silence of the basement, a series of loud, metallic thumping sounds echoed from directly above his head. He looked up at the ceiling and saw the large metal air ducts. To his horror, he could see the metal surface of the vents slowly indenting downward. Someone was crawling through the narrow air ducts directly above him. The thumping stopped right above where he was standing, and then a violent rhythmic banging began, as if the heavy boots of the intruder inside the vent were trying to kick through the thin metal floor to get down to him. He did not wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran up the stairs, locked the school doors behind him, and drove straight home. The next day, he only told Tom a partial truth, claiming he thought he saw someone, but they were gone when he went back. He was just glad it was his last week working at the school, and he never had to go back into that basement again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. What I am about to tell you is something that has no easy explanation. It is easily the strangest and most unsettling thing that has ever happened to me, or to anyone I personally know. For several years, I worked late hours at a small, dimly lit dive bar about 30 minutes away from my house. It was not really a choice I made because of some great passion for bartending. It was just how things were when you lived out in a more rural area. There were not a ton of jobs close to home, so you basically took whatever you could get to pay the bills. The bar itself was nothing special. It had sticky floors, a loud jukebox, and a handful of regulars who stayed until the very last call. But it was steady work, and most nights went by without much happening. The night this all occurred started out exactly like any other. My shift had gone by slowly, filled with the usual routine of pouring draft beers, washing glasses, and listening to the same old stories from the locals. After closing everything up, locking the back doors, and turning off the neon signs, I got into my car and started the long drive home. Most of the way back to my house consists of nothing but a series of winding back roads. There is hardly any traffic out there at that hour. There are barely any lights, barely any other cars, and barely any signs of life. Honestly, it is just long stretches of sharp curves cutting through deep woods and open farmland. It is usually a pretty quiet and peaceful drive. I have always actually liked it for that reason. It acted like a built-in detox for my brain, where I had time to zone out, listen to the hum of the tires, or think about the strange characters I had met at the bar that night. But not long into the drive, I remember thinking to myself how unusually foggy it was. Now, I have driven these exact roads more times than I can count. I know every turn, every dip, and every pothole. But that night, the visibility was worse than anything I had seen in a very long time. It was a thick, heavy blanket of white that seemed to swallow the road ahead of me. I actually had to ease off the gas pedal and take it much slower than usual, because I could barely see more than a few car lengths ahead. Even flipping on my high beams did not help at all. It actually made things worse. The bright lights just made the thick fog glow and reflect right back at me, almost like I was driving directly into a solid wall of white paint. It started to really annoy me because I knew this slow pace would add a lot of extra time to my trip, and I was absolutely exhausted from standing on my feet for 8 hours. I was about halfway home when I first noticed something unusual. Through the dense fog, maybe a little off to the right side of the road, there was this faint, yellow blinking light. At first, I figured it was just some kind of temporary roadside marker, or maybe a reflector on a farmer's fence line. But as I kept driving, the light did not get any closer, and it did not fall behind. It just stayed right there, blinking at a perfectly steady rhythm, like it was moving along with me. It was keeping pace with my car from somewhere deeper in the woods, just beyond the tree line. The whole thing felt incredibly off. I could not tell how far away the light actually was, because the fog was playing tricks on my depth perception. After about another minute of driving with that yellow light hovering in the exact same spot relative to my window, I started getting a cold, heavy feeling in my stomach. I could not even explain why I was so nervous. Something about the steady, mechanical blinking just did not sit right with me. I decided to slow down a bit, thinking that if I let off the gas, the light would keep moving forward, and I would finally get a better sense of what it actually was. Or, hopefully, it would just continue onward, disappear into the darkness, and I would not have to worry about it anymore. But as I eased the car down to almost a crawl, the light did not pull ahead. It adjusted its speed instantly. It kept blinking at the exact same steady rhythm, still holding that same precise distance off to the side of my passenger window. Whatever it was matching my speed perfectly, as if it were tethered to my car by an invisible string. That was the moment when I really started to get spooked. My heart rate began to climb, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened. I decided to bring the car to a complete stop right there in the middle of the empty road, just to see if the light would do the same. And sure enough, the moment my tires stopped rolling, the light stopped too. It stayed right there, hovering in the fog, blinking in the exact same spot with the same unchanging rhythm. I sat there in the silence of my cabin, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. I debated whether I should just perform a quick U-turn and drive all the way back to the main highway, or if I should just step on the gas and try to outrun it. But before I could make a decision, the light changed. The blinking did not stop, but the light itself began to get significantly brighter. It was like a small flame catching a sudden gust of wind and flaring up. It was not flashing any faster, but it was burning much stronger with each pulse, as if whatever was generating it had suddenly become more active, or was drawing more power. That was more than enough to push me over the edge. I was not about to sit there in the dark and wait for this thing to get any closer or weirder. I reached down to shift my car into reverse so I could back up and get out of there. But that was when I realized the interior of my car was completely quiet. The engine was not running. I swear to God, the car was dead silent. I had no idea how that was even possible. I had not turned the key, and there had been no sudden sputter or shake to indicate the engine had stalled. It had just died without making a single sound. The dashboard lights were completely dark, and the headlights had flickered out, leaving me in total blackness, save for that pulsing yellow light outside. The only way to kill the engine like that would have been to physically turn the key, but I distinctly remember never touching it. My hands were shaking at this point, and my hands never shake. I pour drinks and carry heavy trays all day long. My hands are usually steady as a rock. As I desperately tried to turn the key in the ignition to restart the car, I could not help but feel that the strange thing outside was directly responsible for my engine dying. I turned the key again and again, but the starter did not even make a clicking sound. The battery felt completely drained, and the engine was totally dead. Meanwhile, that blinking yellow light kept burning brighter and brighter, almost like it was feeding off the electrical energy of my car. My pulse was racing, and my chest felt incredibly tight. I was completely alone on a deserted road, miles from any town, with no working vehicle. Not knowing what else to do, I reached for my phone on the passenger seat, figuring I could at least try to get a video of the light for proof, or try to call the police for help. But as soon as I tapped the screen, nothing happened. The screen remained completely black. My phone had died. I knew for an absolute fact that I had at least 20% battery left when I left the bar. I had literally checked it right before locking the front door, but now it was completely lifeless. Before I could even begin to process the horror of my situation, the yellow light outside suddenly flared to a blinding, brilliant brightness. It was like an exploding star right next to my window. It was so intense that I physically could not keep my eyes open. I threw my arms up in front of my face and squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the heat and the sheer power of what felt like a gigantic light bulb burning right through my eyelids. I held that position for at least 10 seconds, frozen in fear, waiting for the worst to happen. And then, just like that, the bright light vanished. It was completely gone, as if someone had flipped a giant switch. The thick fog was still swirling around the car, but there was no yellow light, no blinking, and no glow in the trees. The woods were completely dark once again. My heart was still pounding against my ribs, but I instinctively reached for the key and turned the ignition one more time. This time the engine roared to life instantly, turning over as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. The dashboard lights illuminated, and the headlights cut through the fog. I did not waste another single second. I slammed the car into drive and stepped on the gas, driving the rest of the way home with my eyes glued to the road ahead. I was terrified that if I looked away, even for a split second, that awful yellow light would reappear in my side mirror. But nothing else happened that night. I made it home safely, locked my front doors, and sat awake until the sun came up. In the days that followed, I told this story to almost everyone I knew. I told my family, my friends, and even a couple of the regular customers at the bar. But no one had an explanation that made any sense to me. I heard every theory you could think of, from ball lightning and swamp gas to secret military drones, but deep down, I knew what I felt. Whatever was out in those woods that night had completely drained the power from my car and my phone, and it was watching me. To this day, I still avoid driving those winding back roads after dark, preferring to take the longer highway route home, even if it adds 30 minutes to my drive. Now, that was just the first strange encounter on the dark roads. This next story happened a couple of years back, and it involves a man named David, who is a long-haul truck driver. David had been driving big rigs for over 15 years, so he was very used to the long stretches of absolutely nothing. He actually preferred the night shifts because the highways were usually clear of commuters, allowing him to cover more ground without the stress of heavy traffic. On this particular night, David was on his second-to-last delivery of a cross-state loop, just trying to knock out the remaining miles so he could finally get back home to his family. The route he was taking had him cutting through one of those desolate desert highways that barely get any traffic at night. There were no towns for miles, no gas stations, and barely even any streetlights. It was just a simple 2-lane road slicing through the open, empty desert under a vast sky full of cold stars. It is the exact kind of drive where you start to feel like you are the only person left on the entire planet. The rhythmic hum of the truck's massive diesel engine was the only sound for miles around. David was about an hour out from his next drop-off destination when he first noticed something in his mirrors. He glanced into his left side mirror and was surprised to see a pair of headlights trailing far behind him. It was a dark SUV. It was not riding his bumper or driving in an aggressive manner, but it was definitely following him. It was keeping a very wide, consistent distance, but it adjusted its speed to match David's truck perfectly. No matter how fast or how slow David went, the dark SUV stayed exactly where it was. For nearly 40 miles, the vehicle just hovered there in David's mirrors. It was always visible, always keeping that same strange artificial gap. The driver never tried to speed up, and they never tried to pass, even when the road opened up into long, flat straightaways. At first, David thought it was just a nervous driver who was afraid to pass a massive semi-truck in the dark. He figured they were just using his truck as a guide through the pitch-black desert. But he quickly cast that theory aside, after driving through several clearly marked passing zones with perfect visibility. There was absolutely no logical reason for the driver to stay behind him, unless they were doing it on purpose. As much as David was dying to know what the driver's problem was, he had a tight schedule to keep. He could not afford to waste his night worrying about a strange car. So, he tried his best to ignore the headlights in his mirror. But the longer the tailing continued, the more unsettled he became. It was starting to make his skin crawl, which was something that rarely happened to an experienced driver like him. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, David decided he had had enough. He pulled his massive rig off the highway and into a small, remote roadside rest area. It was not a fully equipped truck stop with a diner and bright lights. It was just a simple dirt lot with a few faded parking lines and a small concrete shed that housed a couple of old vending machines. There were no external lights in the entire lot, except for one single, dim bulb flickering weakly above the vending machines, casting long, dancing shadows across the dirt. David's plan was simple. He would stretch his legs for a minute, grab a cold soda from the machine, and more importantly, let the strange SUV pass him on the highway so he could finally get some peace. But as he checked his side mirrors before shutting down the engine, his heart sank. The dark SUV had pulled into the dirt lot right behind him. It did not park near the truck, though. Instead, it drove over to the far, darkest corner of the lot, turned off its headlights, and just sat there in the shadows. At that point, whatever confusion or discomfort David had been feeling turned into pure, hot anger. He was tired, he was stressed, and he was completely fed up with being followed. Whoever was driving that SUV was about to get a very loud piece of his mind. David aggressively pushed open his cab door, stepped down onto the loose gravel, and began marching directly toward the dark vehicle. He did not try to hide his anger at all, keeping his shoulders back and his fists clenched. But as he was stomping his way across the dark lot, the occupants of the SUV must have realized that their cover was blown. Before David could even get halfway to the vehicle, the SUV's engine suddenly roared to life with a loud rev. The driver slammed the vehicle into gear and peeled out of the dirt space like they were running from the law. They kicked up a massive cloud of thick dust and sharp gravel that rained down on the dirt lot. As the vehicle sped past David toward the highway exit, he tried desperately to get a look at the driver through the windows. But the glass was heavily tinted, and the lack of light made it completely impossible to see anything inside. David watched as the SUV swung back onto the empty highway, its tires screeching loudly on the asphalt. Within a matter of seconds, the red taillights faded into the distance and vanished entirely. Part of David was incredibly relieved. The nuisance was finally gone, and he could go back to his work in peace. But another, deeper part of him was highly unsettled. He had just confirmed that this vehicle had indeed been stalking him for hours, and the fact that they fled the moment he approached meant their intentions were almost certainly hostile. As David walked back from the vending machines, which turned out to be completely empty and broken anyway, he realized just how exhausted the entire encounter had made him. The sudden spike of adrenaline had left him feeling completely drained. He did not want to get back on the highway in that state of mind. He figured he had earned a short break to recharge his batteries before finishing the final leg of his route in the morning. He did a quick walk around of his truck, checking the heavy cargo doors to ensure the metal seals and locks were still secure and undamaged. Everything seemed perfectly fine. He climbed back up into his warm cab, locked both of the doors from the inside, reclined his driver's seat, and cracked the window just a tiny bit to let some cool desert air circulate. The dirt lot was completely silent now, and for the first time all night, David felt his muscles start to relax. He reasoned that even if those people meant him harm, they would not turn around and come back. Finding this specific, unlit dirt lot in the middle of a pitch-black desert without any headlights would be nearly impossible. Because of his extreme exhaustion and the newfound quiet, David fell asleep in a matter of minutes. Now it is important to know that David is an incredibly light sleeper. He had to be. When you spend years sleeping in sketchy roadside pull-offs and dark truck stops, you naturally develop a sort of survival instinct. You learn to tune your ears to the slightest changes in your environment. If someone is messing with your fuel tanks, or trying to steal your cargo while you are asleep, waking up quickly is the only thing standing between you and a very dangerous situation. Sure enough, about an hour after he fell asleep, David was suddenly jolted awake by a very faint, distinct sound. It was the light, sharp crunch of footsteps pressing into the loose gravel right outside his truck. Even though he was still groggy from his sleep, his instincts kicked in immediately. He kept completely silent, moving as slowly as possible so as not to make the truck's suspension squeak. He slid over to the side window and gently parted the edge of his window blinds just enough to peer down into the dark lot. To his absolute horror, there were two figures standing near the rear wheels of his trailer. They were crouched down low in the shadows, using a small flashlight with a red filter to inspect the heavy lower latch mechanisms of the cargo doors. They were working in complete silence, signaling to each other with quick hand movements. David did not have a weapon in his cab. He usually did not carry one, but he was fully prepared to grab his heavy metal tire iron and defend his life and his cargo if they managed to break in. As he watched through the sliver of the blinds, one of the men reached into a dark canvas bag and pulled out a large, heavy-duty pair of bolt cutters. They were preparing to cut the steel lock on his trailer. That was the absolute limit for David. Without hesitating for another second, he lunged forward and slammed his hand down onto his steering wheel, activating the truck's incredibly loud air horn. The horn let out a deafening, earth-shaking blast that shattered the quiet of the desert night. The reaction from the two thieves was instantaneous. Both men jumped into the air as if they had been struck by lightning, dropping their tools onto the gravel. They scrambled backward in sheer terror, running as fast as their legs could carry them toward the thick brush on the side of the highway. Not 10 seconds later, a pair of headlights suddenly appeared from the dark highway. It was the exact same dark SUV from before. It roared back into the dirt lot with its lights turned off initially, before whipping around to pick up the two fleeing men. They scrambled into the back doors, and the SUV sped away into the darkness, its tires throwing dirt everywhere. David did not even have time to get out of his cab before the entire ordeal was over. Once his heart rate slowed down enough for him to think straight, he picked up his phone and called the state police. He mostly just wanted to get the incident on official record, but the dispatcher insisted that he stay parked exactly where he was until a patrol unit could arrive to inspect the scene. It took nearly 45 minutes, but eventually, two state troopers pulled into the dirt lot, their flashing blue and red lights illuminating the area. They helped David inspect the back of his trailer with their high-powered flashlights. Sure enough, there were fresh, deep metal pry marks along the lower locking bars of the cargo doors, right where the two men had been working. Luckily, the heavy-duty steel lock had held up, and they had not been able to get the doors open. The officers told David that they had been investigating a string of similar incidents along that specific desert corridor. It was the work of an organized cargo theft ring that targeted lone, parked trucks at night. They would follow a truck for miles, wait for the driver to pull over to sleep, and then strike in the dark. If David had not been such a light sleeper, his entire cargo would have been stolen, and he easily could have been severely hurt or killed if he had surprised them. That incident remained the most terrifying experience of David's long career on the road. But as scary as that was, it is not the only way criminals use the dark empty roads to trap unsuspecting victims. This third story involves a young man named Julian, who was 18 years old at the time and absolutely loved going for late-night drives during the summer. There is truly nothing better than a night drive when the weather is warm. You can roll all the windows down, let the warm summer breeze fill the car, and listen to the tires hum on the empty highway. Around Julian's hometown, the roads were almost completely empty after midnight. There were no commuters, no heavy trucks, and very rarely any police patrols. It was the perfect environment for someone who loved to drive, and Julian had a very special car for these drives. His father owned a beautifully maintained BMW M3, a high-performance sports car with incredible speed and handling. Now, Julian was not a reckless teenager who wanted to drag race or destroy his father's prized possession. He had a deep respect for the car, but he did enjoy taking it out to experience its quick acceleration and sharp steering on the winding country roads when no one else was around. On this particular summer night, Julian was out on a solo joyride. The passenger seat was empty, the stereo was turned completely off, and his entire focus was on the beautiful sound of the engine and the rush of the warm wind against his face. It was the only time he felt completely free from the stress of school and everyday life. As he was cruising along the main highway, he suddenly got a strong, almost overwhelming urge to pull off and explore some of the narrow back roads that cut through the surrounding farmlands. It was one of those sudden gut feelings that you cannot really explain, but you know you will not be able to sleep unless you satisfy it. So he took the next exit and began navigating a network of dark, twisting country lanes. The roads out there were extremely narrow, lined with tall cornfields on both sides, and filled with sharp, unexpected bends. Julian let the car open up a bit, taking the curves with just enough speed to feel the high-performance tires grip the asphalt. The world felt completely dead. It was just him, the sports car, and the endless black road. But as he came around a particularly sharp bend, his headlights caught a sudden flash of metallic reflection up ahead. Julian gasped and slammed his foot onto the brake pedal. The ABS system kicked in, the tires shrieked, and the car slid forward, coming to a halt just a couple of feet away from an object, sitting directly in the center of the lane. Once his breathing slowed down, Julian stared through the windshield to see what he had almost crashed into. It was a standard metal shopping cart. It was just sitting there, perfectly centered in the middle of the dark road, miles away from any grocery store or shopping center. The way his headlights bounced off the metal basket was the only reason he had seen it in time. The entire situation made absolutely no sense. Why would a shopping cart be sitting on a remote country road at midnight? Against his better judgment, Julian pushed the button to put the car in park, activated his hazard lights, and stepped out of the driver's seat to investigate. Looking back, he knew he should have just put the car in reverse and driven away, but his curiosity completely took over. The warm night air was filled with the sound of thousands of crickets, and the only other noise was the soft, metallic ticking of the hot BMW engine cooling down. Julian walked slowly up to the shopping cart, his eyes searching the empty basket. He half expected to find something bizarre inside, but it was completely empty. It was just a normal shopping cart. As he turned around to head back to his idling car, a sudden movement on the side of the road caught his eye. Two dark figures suddenly burst out from the tall cornfields just a few yards away. They were sprinting at full speed, coming straight toward him. In that split second, Julian's survival instincts took over. His brain did not even have time to process who they were or what they wanted. He knew it was a matter of life or death. He turned and bolted back to the BMW, throwing himself into the driver's seat and slamming the heavy door shut. His hand flew to the start button and punched it, forcing the engine to roar back to life. But just as he grabbed the gear shifter, the two figures reached the car. One of them stopped a few feet away, but the other one did not even slow down. He ran at full speed directly into the passenger side of the car, crashing into the door with a loud, sickening thump. He hit the car so hard that Julian felt the entire chassis shake, yet the man did not even seem to flinch. It was as if he did not even realize the car was a solid object. Julian locked eyes with the man through the passenger window, and the sheer terror of that moment froze him in place. The man's face was pressed close to the glass. He had wide, beady, bloodshot eyes that stared with a vacant, empty expression. His clothes were completely torn to shreds, as if he had been running through thick briars and barbed wire fences in the dark fields. His hair was wild and soaking wet with sweat, and his face was smeared with a mixture of dark dirt and fresh blood. He looked like a monster. He did not scream or make a sound, but he began frantically clawing and fumbling at the passenger door handle, trying desperately to pull the door open. Thank God the BMW had an automatic locking system that engaged the moment Julian had started the engine. The sight of those bloody hands grabbing the door handle snapped Julian out of his paralysis. He slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, turned the steering wheel hard to swerve around the metal shopping cart, and sped down the road, leaving the two figures behind in a cloud of dust. During the entire drive home, Julian was a complete nervous wreck. He was shaking violently, his mind racing with a million different thoughts. Part of him felt a strange sense of guilt, wondering if that bloody man was actually a victim who was desperately running for his life and needed medical help. But another, louder part of him knew that the shopping cart had been placed there as a deliberate trap to get him to exit his vehicle. He picked up his phone and called the local police department, explaining the situation and giving them the exact location of the shopping cart and the two men. The dispatcher assured him that they would dispatch a patrol car to investigate the area immediately. When Julian finally pulled into his parents' driveway, he got out of the car to inspect the passenger side, his heart sinking as he turned on his phone's flashlight. The damage was far worse than he had imagined. There was fresh, dark blood smeared across the entire passenger door. It was streaked along the side mirror, rubbed into the door handle, and splattered across the rear panel. There was also a noticeable dent near the center of the door from the sheer force of the man's body hitting the metal. The next morning, Julian's father walked outside, saw the blood and the dent on his prized sports car, and completely lost his temper. He began shouting, accusing Julian of being reckless, driving too fast, and getting into an accident that was going to cost thousands of dollars to repair. Julian tried to explain the terrifying truth of what had happened, but his father was too angry to listen, assuming Julian had probably hit a deer and was making up a wild story to cover it up. It was not until the local police department called their house later that day that his father finally understood. The police had gone out to the country road and found the empty shopping cart, along with signs of a struggle in the dirt nearby. They explained that this was a known, highly dangerous ambush technique used by local criminals. They would place an obstacle like a shopping cart or a fallen branch in the road to force drivers to stop and get out. Once the driver was out of the car, they would assault them, steal their vehicle, and take everything they had. The bloody man who had slammed into Julian's car was likely either high on drugs or had been severely injured while hiding out in the rough fields, which explained his vacant stare and the incredible amount of blood left on the passenger door. If Julian had not reacted as quickly as he did, or if his car doors had been unlocked, he likely would not have survived that night. After that, Julian's father was incredibly apologetic for his initial anger, and he never let Julian take the sports car out for late-night drives again. The physical damage to the car was eventually repaired, but the psychological scars remained. To this day, Julian never stops his vehicle for any obstacle in the road, choosing instead to put his car in reverse and get as far away as possible. These three stories serve as a dark, chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk on the empty roads at night. Whether it is a bizarre, unexplained electrical phenomenon in the deep woods, a calculated gang of cargo thieves waiting in the shadows of a desert rest stop, or a violent trap set on a quiet country lane, the highways are not always as peaceful as they seem. When the sun goes down and you are driving alone, you are completely on your own, and your survival might just depend on your instincts and your ability to keep moving. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Sometimes, the place where you feel the safest can become the most dangerous place in the world. We build our lives around routines, thinking that our homes are shields against the outside world. But the truth is, a single moment can shatter that illusion forever. Our first story begins on a quiet Saturday night, with a man who was already going through the darkest period of his life. He was a single guy in his mid-30s, living alone in a two-story house. Just a few months prior, his life had been completely turned upside down. He had just broken up with his girlfriend of 5 years. This was the woman he thought he was going to marry. They had talked about buying a house together, starting a family, and growing old. When that relationship ended, it felt like his entire future had been erased in an instant. The psychological damage of the breakup was severe. He was completely lost, spiraling into a deep depression. For weeks, he barely took care of himself. His routine was incredibly bleak. He would wake up in the morning, speak to absolutely no one, drag himself to work, speak to no one there, and then come straight home to spend the rest of the day in bed. On the weekend, things got even worse. He would forget to eat, and he wouldn't leave the house for days. He spent his time binging movie after movie on his TV, barely registering what he was watching. It was just a way to numb his mind and keep the silence of the empty house at bay. And so, on this particular Saturday night, he was slumped on the couch in his bedroom, which was on the second floor of the house. He had a TV set up in his room, so he rarely watched anything downstairs. It was a little after 9 in the evening. He looked down at his phone and saw that his mom was calling him. It was the 4th time she had called that day. He knew she was just worried about him and wanted to make sure he was eating, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. He didn't have the energy to pretend he was okay, so he let it ring out. Eventually, he got tired of the movie he was watching and backed out to the main menu. He scrolled through the options and decided to put on a random, low-budget horror movie. The thumbnail was grainy, and he had never heard of it, but he figured it would be good background noise to help him fall asleep. But about 20 minutes into the movie, he realized it was even worse than he expected. The audio mixing was a complete disaster. Every time the characters spoke, their voices were so quiet that he had to turn the volume way up just to understand what they were saying. But then, a second later, a loud sound effect would blast through the speakers and nearly rupture his eardrums. It was incredibly frustrating, but he was too lazy to get up and change it. So he kept it on. At some point, he started noticing a very strange sound. It was a sharp metallic clang. It sounded exactly like a hollow metal pipe hitting concrete. At first, he assumed it was just a cheap sound effect from the movie. But as he kept watching, he realized the sound didn't match anything happening on the screen. There were no metal pipes in the scenes, and the characters were just walking around a normal house. Not only that, but the sound was happening almost every minute, on the dot. It was the exact same pitch, the exact same volume, and the exact same metallic ring. It was far too consistent to be a deliberate sound design choice. He started thinking about how terrible the movie production must have been for the filmmakers to leave a looped sound effect in the final cut. The sheer bad quality of it actually kept him watching, in a weird way. Halfway through the movie, he decided to get up to use the bathroom. For some reason, instead of just letting the movie play, he actually grabbed the remote and paused it. He walked to the bathroom, did his business, and came back to the bedroom. He sat back down on the couch and picked up the remote, hovering his thumb over the play button. But right before he could press it, the silence of the room was shattered. He heard it again. That exact same sharp, metallic clang. He froze. His thumb stayed hovering over the remote, and he stared blankly at the paused television screen. The movie was completely still. The speakers were silent. There was no audio coming from the TV at all, yet the sound had been clear as day, and it had come from somewhere nearby. At this point, a cold chill ran down his spine. He realized that the sound had never been part of the movie. It had been happening in real life this entire time. He stayed completely still, barely breathing. He desperately hoped that his mind was just playing a trick on him, or that his ears were ringing. He kept his eyes locked on the frozen screen and just listened. The silence in the house was heavy and suffocating. Then, about 45 seconds later, the sound came again. A sharp, clear, metallic clang. He didn't waste another second. The laziness and depression that had kept him glued to the couch for weeks instantly evaporated. He jumped up, grabbed a heavy metal knife from his desk, and held it tightly. His heart was hammering against his ribs as he stepped out of his bedroom and began searching the house. He moved room to room, checking behind doors, looking inside closets, and peering into the dark corners of the downstairs area. He was terrified of what he might find, but every single room was completely clear. There was no one there. In fact, nothing in the house seemed to be out of place at all. As he walked back up the stairs, still holding the knife, the metallic clang rang out once more. This time it wasn't as loud. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of his bedroom, where he had been sitting the entire evening. But he had just been in there, and there was no one else in the room. It made absolutely no sense. And then it hit him. It was spring, and the weather had finally started to warm up. Because of that, he had gotten into the habit of cracking his bedroom windows open in the evening to let some cool air inside. He realized that the sound wasn't coming from inside his house at all. It was coming from right outside. That thought was somehow even more terrifying than the idea of an intruder inside. He slowly walked over to his bedroom window, trying to make as little noise as possible. He reached out, took the edge of the curtain, and parted it just a fraction of an inch to look down into his backyard. His backyard was mostly dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, sitting right in the middle of his lawn, about 20 feet away from the house, was one of his metal deck chairs. It had been moved from the porch to the grass, and standing right next to the chair was a figure. It was a child. He couldn't make out any facial features because of the darkness, but the silhouette was far too small to be an adult. It was definitely a young kid. The child was holding a long, thin object that looked like a PVC pipe. As the man watched from behind the curtain, the child raised the pipe and smacked it hard against the metal frame of the deck chair. Clang! The child must have seen the curtain move, because the moment the man looked out, the kid stopped and stared directly up at his bedroom window. The man instantly stepped away from the window, his body trembling with fear. It felt completely surreal. He couldn't understand what a little kid was doing in his backyard in the middle of the night, holding a pipe and hitting a chair over and over again. He wondered if the child was sleepwalking, or perhaps had some kind of mental disorder that caused him to wander away from home. It was the only logical explanation. But then he remembered how long this had been going on. The sound had been happening for nearly an hour. That meant this little kid had been standing out in the dark, cold yard, hitting a chair with a pipe for an hour straight. It was incredibly disturbing. He tried to calm himself down and think rationally. If a child was lost and confused, he couldn't just leave him out there in the dark. He had to go check on him and see if he could help. He walked downstairs, keeping the lights off so he wouldn't draw attention to himself. He made his way toward the back door that led to the yard. Before reaching for the lock, he reached over and switched on the porch light, thinking the sudden light would make the kid feel safer and allow him to get a better look at him. He put his hand on the metal doorknob and began to turn it. But right as the latch clicked, he froze. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread washed over him. Something about the situation felt incredibly wrong. It felt like a trap. If this kid was truly lost and scared, why hadn't he walked up to the house and knocked on the door? Why hadn't he called out for help? And why would a lost child spend an hour standing in the yard, rhythmically hitting a chair with a pipe? It didn't make any sense. No child would do that. His gut was screaming at him not to open that door. He slowly let go of the doorknob and took a step back. To the left of the back door, there was a small, narrow window that overlooked the porch and a portion of the backyard. The window had blinds, and the room behind him was pitch black, so he knew anyone outside wouldn't be able to see him. He crept over to the window, raised his hand, and gently tilted two of the blind slats with his fingers, just enough to look through. What he saw made his heart stop. Right below his back door, crouching down in the shadows where the porch light didn't reach, were two grown men. They were dressed entirely in black clothing. They were positioned on either side of the doorway, crouching low, waiting. It was clear that the moment he opened that door and stepped outside to help the child, they were going to ambush him. He was staring through the tiny gap in the blinds, paralyzed with shock. But then one of the men suddenly turned his head. His eyes locked onto the exact spot where the man was looking through the blinds. The man instantly dropped the blinds, turned, and sprinted back toward the stairs. At the same exact moment, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. He was halfway up the stairs when a deafening crash echoed through the house. The men were kicking the back door in. He didn't look back. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him into his second-floor bathroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. He was having a full-blown panic attack, gasping for air. his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the phone. He whispered his address to the emergency dispatcher, crying and begging them to send help immediately. Through the bathroom door, he heard the heavy sound of wood splintering downstairs, followed by loud, hurried footsteps. They were inside his house. He heard the heavy footsteps moving across the downstairs living room, and then they started coming up the wooden stairs. Each step felt like a countdown. He held his breath, pressing his back against the bathroom door, trying to make himself as small as possible. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and began moving down the hallway, right toward the bathroom. He watched the metal doorknob. Slowly it began to turn. It jiggled back and forth, but the lock held. Then a massive bang shook the door as someone kicked it from the outside. That was the breaking point. The man lost all control and screamed at the top of his lungs, telling them that the police were already on their way and that they had his address. The moment his voice echoed through the house, the banging stopped. There was a brief pause, and then he heard the sound of footsteps sprinting back down the stairs. A few seconds later, the back door slammed shut, and the house fell into a heavy, terrifying silence. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They searched the house and the surrounding property, but the men and the child were long gone. The only physical evidence they found was the moved deck chair in the yard and the shattered frame of the back door. The man explained everything to the officers, but because he didn't have any security cameras, there was very little they could go on. However, when he told them about the child holding the PVC pipe, the officers' expressions changed. They took the situation much more seriously. According to the police, using a child as bait in a home invasion was a highly calculated and incredibly rare tactic. It suggested that these weren't just random, impulsive criminals. They were organized, and they were willing to use extremely manipulative methods to get their targets to open the door. That was the scariest part of the whole ordeal for him. He couldn't stop thinking about that poor child. Was the kid being forced to do that? Was he kidnapped? Every scenario he imagined was deeply disturbing. The police told him he was likely the victim of a random targeted attack, but he couldn't help but feel like the setup was far too elaborate to be completely random. Since that night, nothing else has happened, and he has since moved out of that house and tried to rebuild his life. But he still prays that the little kid is somehow safe out there, even though he knows the reality of the situation is likely very dark. Now, you might think a home invasion like that is a once-in-a-lifetime nightmare. But for our next story, the terror didn't come from a quiet backyard. It came from an everyday sight that we all associate with childhood and happiness. This happened in the spring of 2024. The narrator was a college senior, just a few weeks away from graduation. Like many college students, he was stressed, exhausted, and desperately needed a break. But unlike his friends, who loved to spend their spring break partying in crowded places like Miami, he preferred to go back home to his parents' quiet suburban house to just relax and do nothing. This spring break was no different. He planned to go completely off the grid for a week, away from the stress of schoolwork and the mindless drama of campus life. He was particularly frustrated because his teaching assistant had recently denied a grade dispute for a midterm exam, and he wanted to clear his head. It was a Monday morning, and he had absolutely no plans for the day. But he had always been a morning person, and he found that maintaining a routine was the only way to feel like he had his life together. Even though he was on vacation, he still set his alarm for 6 in the morning so he could get an early workout in at the local gym. By 20 past 6, he was dressed and driving down the quiet residential roads of his hometown. It was a 15-minute drive through a very safe, peaceful neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and childhood friends grew up together before moving away. As he was driving, listening to some music, something strange on the side of the road caught his eye. Parked along the curb was an old ice cream truck. Its engine was turned off, and all of its lights were dark. In the middle of July, seeing an ice cream truck wouldn't be strange at all. But this was mid-March. The weather was still chilly, and all the local children were in school. There was absolutely no reason for an ice cream truck to be sitting on a quiet residential street at 6:30 in the morning. As he drove past, he slowed his car down slightly and looked through the driver's side window. The truck appeared to be completely empty. He turned the corner, leaving the truck behind, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He had lived in this neighborhood his entire life, and he couldn't remember ever seeing an ice cream truck on these streets, not even when he was a little kid. It just wasn't that kind of neighborhood. He eventually brushed it off, went to the gym, got a solid workout in, and grabbed a quick bite to eat. By the time he drove back toward his house, he had forgotten all about the truck, but as he turned onto his street, he froze. The ice cream truck was still there. It hadn't moved an inch from the spot where he had seen it hours earlier. This felt very strange to him. In his neighborhood, the residents were highly protective of their space. If a strange vehicle sat parked in front of someone's house for more than an hour, the neighbors would usually call the police. He remembered a time when a neighbor had yelled at him and his friends just for parking on the street while waiting for someone. So, it was highly unusual that no one had complained about the truck yet. Curiosity got the better of him. Instead of pulling into his driveway, he decided to drive around the block and past the truck one more time, just to see if anyone was inside now. As he drove past slowly, he looked over. This time, there was someone sitting in the driver's seat. Because the student was driving so slowly, it was obvious he was looking. The man in the truck turned his head and locked eyes with him. The man looked deeply unsettling. He had an incredibly long, almost cartoonishly pointed nose, and a messy, unkempt beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He looked like someone who had been living out of his vehicle for a long time. The look he gave the student was cold and empty, and it immediately made him feel incredibly uncomfortable. He drove straight home, parked his car, and went inside. His parents were both at work, so he had the entire house to himself. He spent the next few hours trying to relax, watching videos and playing games on his laptop. Later that afternoon, around 3 o'clock, he decided to walk down his long driveway to check the mailbox. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and the street seemed completely normal. But as he reached the end of the driveway and opened the mailbox, he glanced down the street. His heart sank. Parked just 3 houses down, on the opposite side of the road, was the ice cream truck. It wasn't facing him, but there was no doubt in his mind that it was the same vehicle. A wave of dread washed over him. The truck had been parked on a completely different street that morning. There was no logical reason for it to be parked near his house now, unless the driver had followed him home from the gym. He quickly grabbed the mail, turned around, and walked back inside, trying his best to look calm so he wouldn't alert the driver that he had noticed him. Once he was inside, he ran up the stairs to a guest bedroom that had a clear view of the street. He carefully pulled the edge of the curtain aside and looked through the window. Sure enough, the ice cream truck was sitting there. He watched it for 10 minutes, but nothing happened. No one got out, and the vehicle didn't move. Eventually, he realized he couldn't spend his entire day staring out the window. So he went back to his room to do some work on his laptop, but he couldn't focus. Every 30 minutes, he felt an overwhelming urge to go back to the guest bedroom and check on the truck. Every time he looked, the truck was still there, but it was always in a slightly different position. The driver was slowly moving the vehicle up and down the street, as if trying to find a better angle to watch the house. He debated whether or not to call the police. He felt silly because technically, the truck was parked on a public street, and the driver hadn't committed any crime. He didn't want to waste the police's time, but he was also deeply unsettled. Then he remembered that his older brother was a passionate birdwatcher and kept a high-powered pair of binoculars in his bedroom closet. He walked over to his brother's room, searched through the closet, and found them. He returned to the guest bedroom, stood back from the window, and raised the binoculars to his eyes, focusing the lenses directly on the driver's side window of the ice cream truck. What he saw made him gasp in pure horror. The strange man with the pointed nose and the scraggly beard was sitting in the driver's seat, and he was holding a pair of heavy black binoculars of his own, pointed directly at the guest bedroom window where the student was standing. They were looking directly at each other through binoculars. The moment the man realized he had been spotted, he immediately dropped his binoculars, turned the key in the ignition, put the truck in drive, and sped away down the street. Trembling, the student immediately called 911. He explained to the dispatcher that an ice cream truck had been circling his neighborhood all day, that the driver had followed him home, and that the man had been using binoculars to spy on his house. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She told him that they would send a patrol car to keep an eye on the neighborhood. She noted that an ice cream truck was a very distinctive vehicle, so it shouldn't be hard to spot if it returned. When his parents came home later that evening, he told them the entire story. They were concerned, but they also tried to reassure him. They figured the guy was just a strange transient who had moved on after being caught. They told him not to worry about it anymore. He managed to calm down, and because he was exhausted from the stress of the day, he fell asleep quickly. But sometime in the middle of the night, he woke up suddenly. He didn't know why. He reached over, grabbed his phone, and saw that the time was just after 3 in the morning. He lay there in the dark, silent room, listening, and then he heard it. It was a very faint, tinny sound. It was so quiet that at first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he focused, his blood ran cold. It was the classic, distorted jingle of an ice cream truck. Before he could process what was happening, a soft, sharp sound clicked against the glass of his bedroom window. Tap, tap. Someone was throwing small rocks at his window. He sat frozen in his bed, staring at the wall. The combination of the faint, creepy music and the tapping on his window was like something out of a horror movie. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. Finally, using every ounce of willpower he had, he crept out of bed and walked toward the window. He stood to the side of the frame, took a deep breath, and in one swift motion pulled the curtain aside. Standing in the middle of his dark front yard, bathed in the pale moonlight, was the man with the pointed nose. He was staring directly up at the window. But he wasn't alone. Standing on either side of the man, holding his hands, were 2 very small figures. They looked like young children, but because of the extreme darkness, he couldn't see their faces. They just stood there, motionless, staring up at the house. The student backed away from the window, his heart hammering in his chest. He ran down the hallway, woke his father up and told him what was happening. While his father grabbed a heavy flashlight and ran downstairs, the student dialed 911 again. His dad unlocked the front door and ran out onto the lawn, but by the time they got outside, the yard was completely empty. The man and the children had vanished into the shadows, and there was no sign of the ice cream truck. The police arrived shortly after and searched the area, but they found nothing. A few days later, the student's spring break ended, and he had to return to his college campus. He was terrified to leave his parents, but they promised to remain on high alert and keep all the doors and windows locked. For nearly a month, nothing else happened. He began to hope that the nightmare was finally over, but then his mother called him. She sounded completely devastated. She told him that a missing persons case had just gone public in their hometown. 2 6-year-old twin children, a boy and a girl, had disappeared from a neighborhood just 30 minutes away from their house. The moment his mother said those words, his mind flashed back to that night. He remembered the man standing in his front yard, holding the hands of 2 small, silent figures in the dark. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The children he had seen in his yard weren't just random kids. They were the missing twins. The absolute horror of the situation made him physically sick. He couldn't understand why a man who had kidnapped 2 young children would risk everything to follow a college student home, spy on his house for hours, and then show up in his yard in the middle of the night to throw rocks at his window. It was incredibly twisted and made no sense. The only explanation he could come up with was that the man was deeply disturbed and didn't think like a normal person. He had wanted to toy with him, to show him what he had done, knowing that the student wouldn't be able to do anything to stop him. His mother contacted the police to report the connection, but they never heard anything back. He still thinks about those kids every single day, wondering if they are still out there somewhere, and the thought continues to haunt him. But if you think that story is unsettling, our final story tonight shows a completely different kind of nightmare. This is a story about how a total stranger can slowly and systematically dismantle your sense of reality and push you to the very edge of sanity. This happened to a man who worked as a sales associate for a BMW dealership. It was a highly competitive, high-stress job, and his weeks were always packed with client meetings, test drives, and endless paperwork. because he worked on commission. His income depended entirely on his ability to close deals. This meant that even when he wasn't at the dealership, he was constantly working. He was answering emails, sending text messages, and most importantly, answering his phone. In his line of work, you could never ignore a call. If an unknown number called, it could be a wealthy client looking to buy a luxury vehicle or someone responding to an ad. So, he had a strict rule. He answered every single phone call, no matter what time it was. As you can imagine, this meant he received an incredibly high volume of spam and scam calls, but he had no choice. He just had to filter through them. One night, it was well after 10 o'clock. He was already in bed, winding down after a grueling 12-hour shift at the dealership. He was exhausted and looking forward to getting some sleep. Suddenly, his phone began to ring. He picked it up and looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, and it wasn't saved in his contacts. Normally, he would have answered it automatically, but because it was so late and he was so tired, he hesitated. He decided to let it go to voicemail. If it was a real client, they would leave a message, and he could deal with it in the morning. The phone stopped ringing. No voicemail notification appeared, but just 2 minutes later, the exact same number began to call again. He sighed, feeling a bit irritated, but he sat up in bed and swiped to answer. He cleared his throat and tried to use his professional, polite sales voice, just in case it was an important client. "Hello, this is his name. How can I help you?" At first, there was no response. All he could hear was a thick, heavy layer of static. It sounded like a bad radio connection, an uneven, fuzzy hiss that went up and down. He was just about to hang up, thinking it was a robocall, when he heard something else beneath the static. It was a voice. He pressed the phone tighter against his ear and listened closely. The voice was talking about the pricing of a specific BMW model, the availability of a certain color option, and the process of setting up a test drive for the upcoming weekend. He froze. His heart stopped. The voice on the line was his own. It was a perfect, crystal clear recording of a conversation he had had earlier that day with a client at the dealership. He could hear his exact inflections, his laugh, and the specific details he had shared about the car. It was unmistakably him. He was so shocked and confused that he didn't know what to do. Without saying a word, he slammed his thumb on the screen and hung up the phone. He sat there in the dark room, his phone in his hand, trying to process what had just happened. He wasn't panicking yet, but he felt an incredibly deep sense of unease. He tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe the client he had spoken to earlier had recorded the call for his own notes and had accidentally played it back while calling him. But that didn't make sense. Why would the client call from an unknown number late at night, and why would they play a static-filled recording without saying anything? It was a major stretch, but it was the only thing that kept him from spiraling into panic. The next morning, he decided to call the client from the recorded conversation back, just to clear his head. The client answered immediately and sounded completely normal, friendly, and eager to come in for his test drive. When the salesman gently brought up the strange call from the night before, the client was genuinely confused. He had no idea what the salesman was talking about and said he had been asleep by 9 p.m. The salesman believed him. He apologized for the confusion, hung up, and tried to focus on his work. The rest of the day went by smoothly. He met with several clients, went on test drives, and answered dozens of calls. He tried to put the incident out of his mind, telling himself it was just some weird technological glitch. But that night, at almost the exact same time, his phone rang again. It was another unknown number. It wasn't the same number as the night before, but it was similar. With a shaking hand, he answered it. The exact same thing happened. The thick, fuzzy static filled his ear, and then he heard his own voice. But this time, it was a completely different conversation. It was a recording of a call he had had that very afternoon with a completely different client. He hung up immediately. At this point, he knew this was no glitch. This was highly coordinated, deliberate, and personal. Someone was targeting him. And as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized something even more disturbing. The recordings only featured his side of the conversations. He couldn't hear the clients' voices at all. It was just a one-sided recording of him talking. This meant that whoever was doing this wasn't intercepting his phone calls through some kind of digital hack. If they were tapping his phone, they would have recorded both sides of the conversation. The fact that only his voice was audible meant that someone had been physically close enough to him during the day to record him with a microphone, or they had somehow planted a recording device on his person, in his car, or in his office at the dealership. The thought that someone was constantly standing near him, watching him, and recording his every word without him knowing was absolutely terrifying. He barely slept that night. He kept tossing and turning, imagining that someone was hiding in his closet or looking through his window. Over the next week, his life turned into a living hell. Every single night, without fail, he would receive a call from a random, unknown number, and every single night, he would listen to a static-filled recording of himself speaking to clients from earlier that day. He started recording the calls on a separate device, thinking he might need the evidence. But the mental toll it was taking on him was devastating. He became incredibly paranoid. He couldn't relax for even a single second. Every few minutes, he would catch himself looking out the windows of his house, convinced that a figure was standing in the shadows of his yard, watching him. He started locking his front door with multiple locks. He left the lights on in every single room of his house at night because he was too terrified of the dark. At one point, he even dragged a heavy wooden chair across his bedroom floor and wedged it under the doorknob, just so no one could open the door while he was asleep. During the day, his behavior became even more erratic. Whenever his phone would ring at work, he would refuse to answer it inside the building. He would run out to the parking lot, get into his car, lock all the doors, and answer the call from there, where he could scan his surroundings in 360 degrees to make sure no one was close enough to record him. He looked like a crazy person, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop. Eventually, he decided to go to the police. He felt embarrassed and ridiculous explaining the situation, but he didn't know what else to do. He showed the officer his recordings, but the officer just sighed and shook his head. The officer explained that because there was no direct threat of violence, no blackmail, and no explicit harassment in the calls, there was very little the police could do. They couldn't trace the spoofed, burner phone numbers, and they couldn't launch an investigation over someone playing recordings of public business conversations. The salesman left the police station feeling completely abandoned and alone. But then, a few days later, the calls suddenly stopped. For 3 days, his phone remained quiet at night. Part of him wanted to celebrate, to believe that whoever was doing this had finally gotten bored or scared off by his constant vigilance. But instead of feeling relieved, the sudden silence actually made his paranoia worse. He felt like the stalker was just waiting, playing a game of cat and mouse, trying to make him let his guard down before striking again. He started to think about his mother. His mother was schizophrenic, and she had spent most of her life suffering from severe delusions, believing that the government and random strangers were constantly spying on her. He had always known that he was genetically predisposed to the condition, and now he was terrified that he was finally losing his mind, just like she had. He wondered if he was imagining the whole thing, if his brain was somehow fabricating these phone calls. But he had the physical recordings on his secondary device. They were real. In a desperate attempt to make it stop, he went through the massive, exhausting process of changing his personal phone number. It was a huge headache for his business, as he had to contact all of his current clients, update his online profiles, and change his contact information on all the dealership systems. He knew he would lose business because of it, but he didn't care. He just wanted his life back. For 4 days after changing his number, there was absolute silence. He began to sleep a little better. He started to think that the nightmare was finally over, but on the 5th night, he was sitting on his couch after a long day of work. His phone rang. He looked down at the screen. Unknown number. His hand shook as he swiped to answer. He pressed the phone to his ear, and the familiar, heavy static filled the receiver. Then, his own voice began to play. It was a recording of a call he had made just 2 hours prior, using his brand new, private phone number. That was the moment something inside him snapped. He realized that changing his number hadn't done anything. Whoever this person was, they had direct access to his life, his work, and his personal information. They were always there, watching, listening, and laughing at his attempts to escape. He didn't hang up this time. He didn't stay silent. He screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with pure desperation and rage. I don't know who you are. I don't know why you are doing this to me. If you want money, just tell me. I have money. I will give you whatever you want. Just tell me what you want and leave me alone." He went even further. In his state of absolute panic and irrationality, he shouted his home address into the receiver. "Come to my house. Meet me. Let's get this over with. Just tell me what you want." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The static seemed to fade slightly, and then, for the first time in an entire week, a real voice spoke back to him. The voice was heavily distorted, running through a deep metallic voice changer that made it impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. The voice said a single phrase, 11 o'clock, and then the line went dead. He stood in his living room, his phone in his hand, his breathing heavy. The time was currently 7 p.m. That meant he had exactly 4 hours. Looking back, he knows that what he did next was incredibly foolish and dangerous. He should have called the police immediately, or he should have packed a bag, gotten into his car, and driven to a hotel far away. But his mind was completely broken by the paranoia. He was no longer thinking like a rational human being. He walked up to his bedroom, opened his nightstand drawer, and pulled out his licensed handgun. He loaded the magazine, chambered a round, and walked back down to the kitchen. He sat down at the kitchen table, placed the loaded gun directly in front of him, and turned off all the lights in the house except for a single lamp in the corner of the room. And then he waited. For 4 hours, he sat in absolute silence, staring at the dark hallway, his hand resting near the cold steel of the gun. The thoughts that went through his head during those 4 hours were incredibly dark. He was on the very precipice of a complete mental breakdown. He felt like his entire life had led to this single terrifying moment. 10:30 came, then 10:45, then 10:55. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. He stared at the front door, waiting for the doorknob to turn, waiting for a knock, waiting for the glass to shatter. 11 o'clock came and went. The minutes ticked by. 11:15, 11:30, midnight. No one showed up. The street outside remained completely quiet. The phone did not ring. He sat at that kitchen table for the entire night, unable to close his eyes, holding the gun in his hand until the sun began to rise over the horizon. And that was it. The stranger never showed up, and he never received another mysterious phone call again. The harassment simply stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. But even though the calls were over, the damage had already been done. His mental state was completely shattered. He couldn't return to work at the dealership. He was too terrified to speak to clients, too terrified to answer his phone, and convinced that every person he met was the stalker. He ended up taking a massive amount of time off work and entering intensive therapy to deal with the severe trauma and paranoia. It took him months of hard work and professional help to finally feel safe enough to sleep without a gun by his side. He ended up selling his house and moving to a completely different city, starting over with a new job and a new identity, just to escape the memories of that terrifying week. To this day, he has absolutely no explanation for what happened to him. He doesn't know who was recording him, how they got his new phone number, or why they targeted him in the first place. He doesn't know if it was a coworker, a jealous competitor, a client, or just a random psychopath who enjoyed watching someone slide into madness. The lack of answers is a heavy burden that he still carries. He lives in constant fear that one day his phone will ring and he will hear his own voice on the other end of the line once again. It is a reminder that we are never truly in control, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we can't see, the ones who watch us from the shadows of our everyday lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. My family and I are probably the biggest skeptics in the world. We do not believe in ghosts. We do not believe in urban legends. And we certainly do not scare easily, which is why to this day, I cannot logically explain what happened to me when I was in the 7th grade. It is a story that still gives me chills, and for a long time, I kept it completely to myself. But recently, I was downstairs in the kitchen, and my brother was there getting something to eat. I grabbed a water and asked if he believed in ghosts. He shook his head, but told me about something weird he thought was paranormal. Then I asked him a question I had been wanting to ask for years. I asked, Did you ever try to scare me when I came home from school? I wanted to hear him say yes so I could get some closure. But instead he laughed and said, no, all I did was shoot a Nerf gun bullet at you while you were on the computer. I wished he had not said that. I remembered the Nerf gun, but it was nothing compared to what actually happened to me in the 7th grade. It happened back in 7th grade. I came home from school, went to my bedroom, and put in earbuds to watch YouTube. My mom called to tell me my brother was leaving soon to go to a friend's house, and since my parents worked late, I would be home alone. I was a very quiet kid when home alone because I had this fear that someone was in the house with me. I thought if I stayed silent, they could not find me. It turns out that fear might have been completely true. I paused my video and went to the bathroom. Our house has a very weird layout. Standing in the bathroom facing the door, if you step out and take a left, my brother's room is right at the end of a short hallway. If you go right, you reach a stairway that goes down, stops at a platform in the middle, and then continues down to the main entrance. We also had an alarm that announced which door or window had been opened. I was in the bathroom and right about to flush when I heard a loud thud from my brother's room. I assumed he was about to leave, so I flushed and washed my hands. But after that, there were no more noises. The house felt completely still, but I felt like I was being listened to. I turned off the sink and walked to the bathroom door to lock it. My stomach started to ache from fear. I felt like I was being paranoid, but I could not shake that weird feeling in my gut. I waited for another noise. I did not have my phone on me, so I could not text my brother. We had a landline phone in there, but it made loud noises when you dialed, and I did not want to risk it. And then I heard talking. It was coming from my brother's room, but it was not my brother, and it was not my dad. The muttering was deep and low, and it sent shivers down my spine. I could tell it was a human voice because of the distinct S and T sounds, but I could not understand what it was saying. Then, a slow, heavy pounding noise started. Footsteps came out of my brother's room and slowly made their way down the hallway, stopping dead in their tracks right at the bathroom door. I was absolutely terrified. I threw myself back away from the door near the window, hoping that if they busted in, I could escape. I could not fight whoever it was since I was a weak 7th grader. I covered my mouth to muffle my breathing so they would not know I was in there. The footsteps started again, making their way to the staircase. Then, I heard a loud crashing noise from what sounded like the middle platform of the stairs, and then another crash at the bottom. After that, the heavy footsteps made their way to the front door. I heard the door open and slam shut, and the security alarm went off. I did not know if it was safe, so I crept to the door and rested my hand on the doorknob, still covering my mouth. To the left of me, near the ground, was a small door for our laundry chute that led directly to the basement laundry room. Usually, running from the front door to the basement laundry room would take over 30 seconds. But only about 10 seconds after the front door closed, a violent, aggressive jabbing noise started pounding against the small laundry chute door from inside. I stood there in absolute shock. It sounded like someone took a broom handle and reached up there to stab at the door. The little door was vibrating, and I prayed it would not bust open. Then it ended. I waited in the bathroom for what felt like an eternity, and then quietly crept to my room to call my parents. Nobody picked up, so I just waited, holding my bedroom door handle so no one could open it since I did not have a lock. When my parents got home, they did not believe me. My brother doubted me too when he arrived, but telling this to my brother again recently made his mouth drop. He told me that when we were kids, he used to hear things coming from the attic, and the access panel to that attic was located directly inside his bedroom closet. To this day, we still do not know who or what was in our house that afternoon, and honestly, I try not to think about it too much. But as terrifying as it is to think there is a stranger hiding in your attic, sometimes the threat is living right next door to you, watching your every move. That was the reality for a girl named Alyssa. When Alyssa was 16 years old, she was living with her mother in a very rundown, creepy apartment building in the Bronx, New York. If you have ever lived in or visited certain parts of the Bronx, you know it can be a very intense experience. There were always sketchy characters hanging around the building, and it was generally pretty scary to walk alone at night. Their apartment was located on the 7th floor, and it was the second to last door at the very end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The very last apartment in that hall belonged to a man who lived completely alone. Alyssa and her mother never knew his name, but he was a black man in his late 60s, with very little gray hair left. He was a deeply unsettling person. Nearly every single day, this man would sit outside his apartment door on the hallway windowsill, just staring. Whenever Alyssa would come home, whether she was by herself or with her mother, he would make a point of turning his head and staring at her with a completely blank, emotionless expression. Alyssa's mother told her to stay far away from him and to never engage with him, but then things started to get worse. Every time Alyssa walked past him in the hallway, he would say hello, but he did not just say hi, he would actually call her by her first name. Alyssa had absolutely no idea how this man had found out her name, since they had never spoken, and it made her skin crawl. One evening, Alyssa's mother had to work a late-night shift at her job, which meant Alyssa was going to be home alone all night. She got back to the apartment around 9 p.m., and sure enough, the neighbor was sitting on his usual spot on the windowsill, staring into space. As Alyssa stood at her door, frantically trying to unlock it, the neighbor did not say his usual greeting. Instead, he leaned forward and asked her in a low voice if her mother was working tonight. Looking back, Alyssa deeply regrets what she did next. Out of pure nerves and panic, she foolishly nodded her head, yes, confirming she was home alone. The neighbor did not say another word. He just slowly nodded his head, his expression remaining completely blank. Alyssa quickly slipped inside her apartment, locked the deadbolt, and tried to shake off the creepy interaction. She went about her normal nightly routine. She had a small snack, did some laundry, and then decided to take a warm shower to relax. But while she was standing under the running water, she suddenly heard a strange, low grumbling noise. It was a very odd, muffled sound, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere inside the apartment. Alyssa turned off the shower, her heart racing. The house was quiet, but then she heard a similar grumbling sound coming from the direction of her bedroom. She quickly dried off, threw on the clothes she had brought into the bathroom, and began searching the apartment, terrified that someone had somehow broken in. She checked the closets and under the bed, but there was no one there. However, as she was searching her bedroom, she noticed something extremely small on the wall that shared a boundary with the neighbor's apartment. It was a tiny, perfectly round hole right in the drywall. Alyssa got down on her knees to get a closer look. She leaned in, pressed her eye to the tiny opening, and immediately fell backward onto the floor in absolute horror. On the other side of that tiny hole, there was a human eye looking right back at her. Alyssa realized with a wave of sheer panic that the neighbor had drilled a hole straight through the wall into her bedroom. And then, a sickening realization hit her. She remembered the grumbling noise she had heard while she was in the shower. She ran back into the bathroom and began feeling all along the wall that connected to the neighbor's apartment. Sure enough, hidden near the corner, she found another identical tiny hole. The neighbor had been standing on the other side of the wall, watching her through the holes he had drilled. Alyssa, trembling with fear, immediately called her mother to tell her what was happening. But while she was on the phone, a loud, aggressive pounding started at her front door. It was the neighbor. He was slamming his fists against the door, screaming at the top of his lungs for her to open up. He was shouting, "Open the door right now. I did not drill those holes. I promise you I did not do it." He sounded completely unhinged. Alyssa's mother, hearing the screaming over the phone, yelled at Alyssa to hang up and call the police immediately, promising she would rush home as fast as she could. Fortunately, the police response time in that part of the Bronx was incredibly fast. Within less than 5 minutes, several police officers arrived at the apartment door and detained the neighbor. Alyssa's mother arrived about half an hour later. They pressed full charges against the man for stalking, invasion of privacy, and criminal mischief. The landlord evicted the neighbor immediately, and the building management patched up the spy holes in the walls, sending the entire bill to the creepy neighbor. But sometimes, the most terrifying encounters do not happen in the city or inside our own homes. Sometimes they happen when we decide to step out into the wilderness, far away from safety. This is a story about a camping trip that went horribly wrong. It was told by a young man who decided to join his friend Hal on a weekend getaway. Hal was an Eagle Scout and a massive nature lover, so he was constantly going out on solo camping trips. On this particular weekend, Hal invited his girlfriend, Maya, and at the last minute, he extended the invitation to the narrator. They decided to carpool together, driving 3 hours out into the deep woods. Now, the problem was that Hal did not believe in traditional campsites. He felt that being surrounded by other families and RVs ruined the authentic camping experience. So, instead of going to a state park, Hal drove them down a random, unmarked dirt trail off a dead-end road that he seemed to know about. He drove deep into the forest for a few minutes until he found a spot he liked, and then he parked his truck. It was such an isolated, random spot in the middle of nowhere that the narrator did not even realize they were stopping there to camp at first. Hal unloaded the trunk. Most of the stuff they brought consisted of tents, sleeping bags, food, toilet paper, and first aid equipment. Hal said he usually packed a lot lighter, but was making this an easy trip for Maya and the narrator. Once they found a good place to set up camp, Hal basically assigned them tasks. The narrator set up the 2 tents, while Maya stayed to help him unpack. Hal went off to find dry firewood. He would come back every so often with a couple pieces of wood. Nightfall came quicker than expected. Thankfully, Hal had collected enough wood by then to start a nice fire, and the tents were pitched. They sat by the fire, drinking and reminiscing about old memories, most of which Maya was not in the picture for. The narrator imagined she got tired of hearing their drunken, nonsensical stories because she went to her tent before Hal and the narrator. So, Hal and the narrator stayed up for a little while longer, now being a bit quieter and keeping the laughter to a minimum as a courtesy to Maya. The narrator finished his last beer and was finally feeling it by then. They chatted for a bit more until Hal suddenly told him to be quiet and listen. The narrator heard it too. There was walking out in the distance beyond the area at which the fire lit up. Hal assured him it was likely a deer. When the narrator naively asked, "What if it is a bear?" Hal reassured him that a bear would not come this close to a campfire or the sound of people. The narrator asked him if he was sure about that. Hal did not answer, though. The footsteps seemed to be going in circles, getting ever so slightly louder with each passing minute. When the footsteps got close enough, they started to hear a disturbing noise. It was like a clicking, growling type of noise. The narrator whispered, "Is that a wolf?" Hal did not answer. He just motioned for the narrator to get into the tents. The narrator did what he said. He got into the tent that he pitched for himself, and Hal got into the tent that was pitched for him and Maya. The clicking noise outside was getting more and more clear, and it increasingly became obvious. It was not the sound of a wolf or a bear, or any kind of animal they could imagine. It did not even sound like something of this planet. The light from the fire outside cast an eerie glow onto the walls of the tents, and the narrator had to cover his mouth so that he would not scream when he saw the shadow on the tent walls. Some horrific, huge bipedal thing was walking past his tent. The footsteps were so slow but so heavy. It moved away from his tent toward the direction of Hal's and Maya's tent. The next thing the narrator remembers, besides waiting in absolute horror, was Maya's scream. She screamed as if something were about to kill her. The narrator did not know what was happening, but he heard Hal screaming outside, "Run," over and over. He heard the 2 of them hurrying away outside, so he rushed outside and followed them. They ran in the pitch black, with no flashlights, nothing, and yet they still knew they were being chased by something. Footsteps followed close behind the narrator since he was in the back. By some miracle, Hal managed to lead them right to the car. Without looking back, they all got into their respective seats and Hal floored it down the trail. Hal drove down the dirt trail for about half a minute before they came to a dead end. He had to somehow turn his pickup truck around in this dark forest, not too far from where they were being chased. The narrator urged him to turn off the headlights so that whatever was chasing them would not see them. Hal insisted he needed the lights on, though, so that he would not hit any trees trying to turn the truck around. He shifted from drive to reverse, over and over. Meanwhile, the narrator sat in the back seat biting his nails and clenching his teeth, looking around the woods outside, terrified that he might see that thing from their campsite. At long last, Hal got the truck completely turned around and once again stepped on the gas to get them out of that forest. They left everything at that campsite, at least $100 worth of equipment, but there was zero chance of them ever going back there. What caused Maya to scream was heavy breathing and something pushing into their tent, trying to rip it open. Hal still says he has no idea what that bipedal creature was. These stories remind us that safety is often just an illusion. The realization that an intruder had likely lived in the attic, watching the family through the laundry chute, left a permanent scar on the siblings. For Alyssa, the creepy neighbor spying through the walls shattered her sense of security, forcing her and her mother to move away. As for the camping trip, Hal and Maya never went into the deep woods again. The mystery of what chased them remains unsolved. We like to think we are safe, but sometimes, the things that lurk in the dark are much closer than we think. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I once had 2 job interviews in North Carolina. I lived in New York at the time, and I was taking the drive down there instead of flying just to save some money. My cubicle job at the time absolutely sucked, and the 2 positions I was interviewing for in North Carolina represented a much-needed breath of fresh air. They were stable corporate office jobs with excellent health benefits, retirement plans, and really good starting salaries. Plus, the weather down south would be much better than the freezing winters in New York. I was planning to drive down there on a Thursday night. I took off from work on Friday because that is when the 2 interviews were scheduled. Since I had to work on Thursday, I had to hit the road as soon as I was off work. I stopped by my apartment first to grab my suitcase and the other stuff I was bringing. Then I said goodbye to my family and set off. It was a long 8+ hour drive ahead of me. My estimated time of arrival was into the early hours of the morning. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was heading to a Comfort Inn. I drank about 3 cups of coffee during my first few hours of driving, and for a while I was doing pretty good. But if you are already running on fumes, no amount of coffee is going to keep you going for long. I already did not get much sleep the night before because I was stressing over these interviews. And after a long, busy day at work, the last thing I wanted to be doing was driving close to 9 hours straight. It was very late at night now, and I had about 2 hours left in the drive. There were very few other cars on the road this late at night on a weeknight. The highway was dark, lined with endless rows of tall pine trees that seemed to swallow the light from my high beams. I was starting to feel really sleepy, but I knew most of the drive was behind me, so I kept pushing. Suddenly, on the side of the highway, I saw a man in a suit standing there. He was not walking and he was not moving at all. He was just facing my car as I approached, and as I looked at him while I passed by, I saw his head turning to follow my car. I literally said out loud to myself, "What the fuck?" It was truly bizarre. I almost contemplated turning around and asking if he needed a ride. He was just in the middle of the highway in a suit at like 12:30 at night. I started coming up with stories in my head about what may have happened to him, like maybe his girlfriend kicked him out of the car after an argument. I did this just to keep my mind awake because I felt myself drifting away. Then, something beyond frightening happened. It was only maybe 10 minutes after I had seen that first man that I saw another man on the side of the road coming up. He was also in a suit, and he was also just standing there, perfectly still in the pitch blackness. What the hell was going on out here? I slowed down to pull to the side of the road to possibly ask if everything was okay, and maybe offer him a ride. My tires crunched on the gravel shoulder as I slowed down. I do not really know what I was thinking, but either way, when I was on the shoulder and almost to a complete stop, I looked in the rearview mirror and then turned around completely. That man was just gone. It was like he had completely disappeared into the thin air. I stepped on the gas and got back on the road as fast as I could. I felt like I was losing my mind. I needed to stop for another coffee. I had about an hour and a half to go at this point. I stopped at the first pit stop I could find and bought a medium coffee. I drank a few sips, but as I was sitting in the rest area gas station parking lot, I spotted a man in a suit again. This time he was standing under a light post. It was the exact same man, and this time I got a much clearer view of his face. He looked like a middle-aged white man with short dark brown hair, clean-shaven, and he had a totally neutral expression, but it was the way he was once again facing my car that freaked me out so badly. I turned the car on and got out of there without looking back. I wanted to complete this drive, but the coffee just was not doing it anymore. I felt like I was going to pass out behind the wheel, and I knew I was not going to make it safely. so I pulled off the highway and parked in a random empty parking lot. I angled the driver's seat all the way down and I attempted to go to sleep. As tired as I was, I could not help but feel incredibly scared in this empty parking lot. I was terrified that if I opened my eyes, I would see that man in the suit standing right outside my window. I was slowly drifting into a sleep when something suddenly made me wake up and open my eyes. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me again, but I was startled. I looked around the outside of my car, terrified I was going to see him. I looked out each window, and then I looked through the front windshield, and everything was completely clear. Then, I looked in the rearview mirror, and I felt my soul leave my body for a second. Right there in the reflection, I saw a person sitting in my back seat. I am sure it was the man in the suit again, but I did not look long enough to confirm. I flung the car door open, screamed at the top of my lungs, and fell backwards out of the car. As I crawled backward on the pavement, I kept screaming until I finally got up, looked inside the car, and saw absolutely nobody. The back seat was completely empty. As I came to my senses, I realized my mind had been playing tricks on me all night long. There was no man in a suit. I was just completely exhausted and desperately needed to sleep. I got back in my car, my heart racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Honestly, though, at this point I was far too awake and terrified to actually go back to sleep. I turned the car back on, finished my coffee, and banged out the rest of the drive. By the time I checked into the hotel and got to my room, I fell onto the bed and passed out right away. The next day, my first interview was at 11 a.m., so I did not get much sleep, but I definitely felt somewhat recharged. However, the second my interviewer walked out to greet me, I froze up entirely. My interviewer looked absolutely identical to the image of the man in the suit I kept hallucinating the night before. I know the interviewer noticed me freeze up because I could see the confusion in his face. I tried to recover from this, but it set a really bad tone for the rest of the interview, and I was completely nervous and out of it the whole time. I felt like I was stuck in a dream. I left that interview with only an hour to get ready for my next one. Thankfully, my next interviewer was a woman, and I did much better with that one because I actually ended up getting the job. I still work here and live in North Carolina to this day. Now, my old therapist told me that she thinks the stress of mentally preparing for the interviews, mixed with the extreme lack of sleep, caused me to hallucinate the main cause of my fear and stress. And so, I hallucinated a man in a suit, because that is exactly who I pictured would be interviewing me. I feel like it does not sound too far-fetched, but it does not change how downright horrific the whole ordeal was. Now, let me tell you about another night that I will never forget. I was driving in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, late one night to avoid the heavy traffic getting home. It was probably a little past midnight at this point, and the road was basically completely deserted, which is just the way I like it. I was listening to my usual podcast on the radio when a sharp ding came from my dashboard, alerting me that I was extremely low on fuel. I immediately put a pit stop into my Maps application for the nearest gas station, which turned out to be a little ways up this highly secluded road. About 5 minutes later, I pulled into the gas station on the right side of the road. It was the only parking lot for miles around, as this road was basically nothing but thick woods on each side. The gas station was just some generic, no-name station with dim lighting. As I pulled next to the pump, I noticed a man filling up the tank of his old beaten-up pickup truck. He was staring at me intensely as I walked past him and into the convenience shop. Inside the shop, the air was cold and smelled like old hot dogs. I bought a cheap coffee and paid cash for my gas at the counter. When I came back outside, I noticed the man at the pump was finally getting into his pickup truck, and then he drove away into the darkness. After a couple of minutes of filling up my own tank, I got back in my car and continued my drive. But not even a minute after leaving the gas station, I noticed something strange on the side of the road. Parked on the grass was that exact same pickup truck from the gas station. It was just sitting there next to the woods with all of its lights turned completely off. I thought it was interesting, but I kept driving, looking in my rearview mirror to see if the headlights would turn on. They did not so. I turned my podcast back on and continued my drive home. A few minutes passed, though, and I heard another loud ding come from my car. My dashboard screen showed that one of my tires was suddenly very low on pressure. I slowed down and immediately started hearing a loud rhythmic wobbling sound. I rolled down my window and knew right away that I had a flat tire. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out to investigate. Sure enough, it was my rear driver's side tire, and it was completely flat. I did not think I had hit anything on the road, as I definitely would have felt a bump. That was when a terrifying thought came to my head. What if that guy at the gas station had slashed my tire while I was inside paying? I took out my cell phone and was looking up the phone number for my roadside assistance company on Google. As I was searching, I heard the faint sound of a car or truck engine a little down the road behind me. But oddly, when I looked back, I did not see any headlights. It was just pitch black down there. Then the sound of the engine suddenly stopped, and everything went completely quiet again. I went to my trunk to grab the emergency flashlight out of my toolbox, which my dad had given me 1 year as a Christmas present. I grabbed the long light rod, turned it on, and aimed its bright beam down the road. In the distance, I saw the reflection of a truck's headlights parked on the side of the road about 200 feet away from me. It looked exactly like that pickup truck from earlier. I let out a gasp, dropped everything, and ran straight into the thick woods. I ducked down behind a big bush and a tree, hiding myself in the dark. I took out my phone with trembling hands and called 911. I heard the sound of the truck down the road starting up again, and this time the headlights were turned on. I heard and saw through the branches of the bush as the truck pulled up slowly and stopped right next to my car. After a short, agonizing moment of silence, a man's voice yelled out from the darkness, asking if I needed some help. I knew better than to answer him. The 911 operator finally picked up, and I whispered into the phone, explaining my location and telling her that someone had slashed my tire, and that I believed the person who did it was right there, following me. The lady on the line asked me a bunch of standard questions, asking me to describe the man and his truck. Right then, I heard the heavy sound of the truck door opening and closing. I told the lady over the phone that the man had just gotten out of his truck. She told me to remain completely hidden in the woods if I thought he was a threat, and she asked if I could see if he was armed. And that was exactly when the call suddenly disconnected. I had absolutely terrible cell reception out there in the middle of nowhere. I waited in the freezing dark, hoping she would call me back. I was sure she was trying to, but the call just would not go through. Then I heard the sound of another passing car coming down the road. This new vehicle was slowing down, and then I heard talking. It was the voice of another man. I slowly crept closer to the edge of the woods to get a better view of the road. I saw the man from the pickup truck standing next to this other, stopped pickup truck in the middle of the road. He was talking to the driver. I overheard the creepy man coming up with a fake explanation, telling the driver that he was just helping out a friend whose car had broken down. At that exact moment, I rushed out of the woods and into the road, yelling for help and screaming that I did not know this man at all. Both the man in the stopped truck and the man who followed me whipped their heads around to look at me. I screamed to the driver of the stopped truck that this man had slashed my tire and followed me all the way here. The driver's reaction was to look at the creepy man with a deeply disturbed look on his face. The creepy man immediately began to deny having done anything to my tires, claiming he had never seen me before in his entire life. At the same exact time, he hurried back to his pickup truck, started the engine, and backed up quickly until he cleared both of our vehicles. Then he sped off into the night. The man in the other pickup truck got out of his vehicle and examined my flat tire, confirming it looked like it had been sliced. He kindly offered me a ride into town, but I told him I already had police officers on the way. Sure enough, within a few minutes, a cop car with its blue and red lights flashing pulled up beside us. The driver of the other truck stayed and vouched for me when I told the officer about the creepy man. The police officer said he would go down to the gas station and request to see the security camera footage to see if it caught the pickup driver actually slashing my tire. The officer took down all of my information and waited with me until the roadside assistance tow truck finally arrived. The tow truck driver gave me a ride to a local repair shop in the nearest town, where my dad eventually came to pick me up after a long, stressful wait. I never heard back from that police officer despite calling the station twice, so I guess he did not see anything useful in that diner video footage. It is incredibly scary to think about how close I was to probably being abducted that night. But as terrifying as that night was, Nothing compares to the most horrific night of my life when I drove up to visit my boyfriend, Todd. I am 28 years old, and since Todd lives in a different state, we take turns visiting each other. However, I usually end up going to his place since he has his own apartment, and I still share a cramped place with my sister as roommates. It was winter break, and since I work as a school teacher, I had the entire week off. I was making the long journey in my crappy, unreliable 2009 Hyundai Sonata through a heavy, freezing snowstorm that was quickly turning into a dangerous, full-blown blizzard. Realizing the driving conditions were too dangerous, I decided to seek shelter. I stopped at a small diner for a quick sandwich and some hot coffee. The friendly waitress warned me that the roads were turning into a sheet of ice and recommended a couple of local motels. Overhearing our conversation, a strange man sitting alone at the bar spun around on his stool. He introduced himself to me as Toby and told me about a cheap, decent motel located just 5 minutes up the road. I felt an instant wave of discomfort around him, so I gave him a fake name, Michelle, and left the diner as soon as I paid my check. The snow was falling rapidly as I arrived at the motel. I paid $50 cash for a room with a tacky red carpet. The room had absolutely zero cell reception, so I had to put my boots back on and trudge through the deep snow to the lobby to get the Wi-Fi password. On my way there, I noticed a newly parked car with the dark silhouette of someone sitting silently inside. Back in my room, I managed to get on a very shaky and freezing FaceTime call with Todd. As we texted, I heard a rustling sound from the bathroom and noticed the door was shut. Suddenly, I remembered in my rush to get the Wi-Fi, I had left my motel door completely unlocked. Todd told me to check the door lock immediately. When I slowly opened it, my blood ran cold. There was a fresh set of footprints in the snow leading from that newly parked car directly to my room door. And the car itself was now completely empty. I locked the door and ran to the front lobby. The clerk refused to call the police and instead called his friend in another language. As I looked out the lobby window, I watched Toby walk out of my motel room, look at me through the glass, and drive away in his car. The clerk eventually moved me to another room, but I did not sleep at all that night. I still have no trust in strangers after what happened in that room. These experiences show how fragile our safety really is. Whether it is our minds playing tricks on us from extreme exhaustion, or real-world predators lurking in the dark, danger is always closer than we think. We can only rely on our instincts to get us through. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.